Welcome back. We'd like to get started. And if you would retake your seats, we would appreciate it. The true power of an event, which is why many events do not have a break in between. The true power of an event is how many people come back. And I am absolutely thrilled that you've all come back. I do want to say one special thank you, which I saved for the middle, not because I forgot, but because it truly is the most important person in putting together this event, without whom I and the rest of us could not have done it. For those of you who know the name Inga, please, and she's standing right here. Inga, Inga, Inga. Thank you so much. Inga does everything. Everything. We have two more speakers, and I'm going to call Raheel Raza up as we continue. Thank you for your attention.
I'm so glad to see that most of you are back. Some did escape, but that's always happens. I apologize that we did not allow for direct questions right after the speakers, because the speakers took a little longer, but don't worry, they will all be here for an hour or more. So your questions will be answered for sure. Yesterday, thanks to Alan, we gave an interview to Aspen Radio, was it? And Aspen Public Radio. And the interviewer, we were telling her about this event, and she was asking questions, and at one point she looked at me and she said, so you're going to go out there and stand up in front of a crowd of people and renounce your faith? And I said, no, you got it all wrong. I said, no, I'm not there to renounce my faith. I'm there because of my faith. I'm here because of my deep love of my faith. I'm here to reform my faith. But that doesn't mean, the problems that we are faced with in this Islamist ideology, it's like having a child who becomes a drug addict. You don't renounce them. You find a cure for them because you love them. And this is where I stand. I don't know about the rest of the speakers, but I think that comes through. We want to change a faith that has been stolen from us. And my age can tell you that I've lived through a time when it was very different. I've seen the other side of Islam. I grew up in Pakistan. It was a pluralistic country. It was a pluralistic faith, never thrust down our throat. It had music, art, culture. I want to bring all of that back. And with the help of these wonderful people, we will do it. Another leader in the reform, and of course the founder of the Muslim reform movement, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, known to most of you, son of Syrian refugees, a physician, founder of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. His book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam, and American Muslim Patriots Fight to Save His Faith. This is what we are here for, Zuhdi Jasser.
Thank you, Raheel. Let me get my stopwatch here, make sure I don't go over. Thank you, Raheel. Thank you, Alan, and the rest of the team here at JCC that put this together, and all the sponsors. We couldn't do this without you, and looking at the people that I've shared the podium here with, it's like the America's Got Talent of Muslim reform. I hope I'm not the comedic elderly actor here. And also to my friends in Arizona, as much as I love Sedona, you have to love Aspen. It's beautiful here. In our short time together today, what I want to do is walk you through what we're up against, how we get there, end with solutions, if you will, but also talk to you a little about identity. I think that's one of the main things. A ton of people say that there's so much information, it's just overwhelming. I'm drinking from a fire hose. What do I do? In order to walk away with solutions, you need to understand what the Muslim identity is up against. And to me, that's sort of where the problem is. What is the biggest obstacle? You know, I love this quote from Emerson, and in this era of Trump, if you will, there's a lot of talk about the establishment. What is the establishment, and who owns it, and who is it? And the Islamism, as you've heard frequently today, is about a political party. Political parties in Islamic majority countries that run under the name and the banner of Islam, that have a platform built on Sharia law and Islamic identity. Well, as Ralph Waldo Emerson said, there are always two parties, the party of the past and the party of the future, the establishment and the movement. So ultimately, regardless of what your feelings are about what's happening in Washington, there is a lot of reality to the fact that the establishment is the problem in the Muslim community. And our Muslim reform movement is the beginning of a movement to fight that. And as we look at that, there are ways to divide the world into, we love to divide the world into binary equations, the good and the bad. We've worked after the Cold War in dividing the Muslim world into the good and the bad. There's who's our enemies and who's our friends. In many ways, we're sort of recalibrating that because we lost so much territory in the last 8 years on that. But if there's one thing you get out of the diversity that you're seeing today amongst us, I mean, if we sat and discussed a single passage in the Quran, as Alan saw last night, the volume would get louder, and we would not come to an agreement on how to interpret one sentence in the Quran among us reformers, let alone how to push forth a certain ideology. So to me, that's why the issue is not the details of what is and what is not Islam. Those details, we'll leave it to the professors, to the mosques. The key is to get the clerics and the men in beards and robes out of government, out of societal rights, and to bring universal human rights back to Muslim majority consciousness. So I think ultimately, at the end of the day, just like your own personal relationships, everything starts at who we are and what makes me who I am. Today, I'm blessed by having had the opportunity to read the Quran, to study multiple translations, to learn about Muslim Brotherhood groups from ISNA to the MSA to CARE to MPAC to groups in Europe, and understand that they are the problem, not the solution. But still, by the time I did that, 90-some% of who I am as a Muslim and what I believe to be my superego, my conscience of what was right and wrong and what was my Islam versus their Islam, was already taught to me by my parents. Obviously, you could take somebody programmed in a moral way and deprogram them into radicalism, as Tawfik talked about and others have, by using theological interpretations, as Elham mentioned, and others have, by using the authority of text to radicalize them. But we also realize that if Islam was such a violent and radical religion, the world may have perished a long time ago when you have a quarter of the world's population that follow it. So the question is what do we do with the establishment? Those pictures I had there are me in front of the first mosque in Wisconsin, my military background. When I joined the Navy because there was really only one thing I would die for, and that's the United States and our Constitution. And it's not just an applause line. It is really what I believe. There's no way you can take a kid and radicalize them if they are raised in a family that tells them that the thing that protects your faith, protects your freedom, is your country. I was told that God will protect the faith of Islam. It is not our role to join jihads and all this other nonsense, because that's just not who we are. We need to live in a country, because you could still be Muslim and be living in solitary confinement. Elijah Izbegovich wrote about this in Islam Between East and West, in which he said he was never more Muslim than when he was under solitary confinement under Tito. All he had was God. So therefore, you think to yourself as a humanist, and you say, I really need government to protect my human rights. I don't need government to tell me what my faith is. I will always have God no matter how few rights I have. That's the crux of the argument about the separation of mosque and state. That's the crux of the argument as to why I would die for a military that would protect my freedom under a constitution, and why my parents abandoned their loyalty to Syrian nationalism, their loyalty to any Islamic party, because it never gave them freedom, and it certainly never gave them their faith. So this is what we're missing in our strategy, is encapsulating that And yet in my own mosque, this is an op-ed I wrote in the Arizona Republic in 2014, I go with my family to services on Friday, and here we are at the largest service after Ramadan in the summer of 2014. Hezbollah and Hamas at the time had been sending rockets into Israel. I had been speaking out on television, and sure enough, as is typical, the topic went in the sermon from an attorney who was at a major firm in Phoenix, who also was the head of the Islamic Education Committee at our mosque, started talking about Islamophobia and saying that we have even Islamophobes inside our community, and he started talking about passages in the Quran that talk about spies within the Muslim community, and said even doctors appear on Fox News and slander our community and speak ill of Islam, and they are the enemies of Islam. And you saw in Elham's slides how the Brotherhood teaches about who the enemies of Islam are. My son, who was 12 at the time, elbows me and says, "Dad, I think they're talking about you." And I'm like, "Zakaria, you're exactly right." And, this is the problem. And my wife, we leave, we're just really upset about the platform that had been used to attack not only a family within the community, but thankfully, as I always do, was recording the sermon. We took it, we transcribed it, posted it on our website, did an op-ed in our Arizona Republic about what happens, how we're bullied in our community when we try to take on the establishment. And ultimately, this is what you do. You expose it. Since then, contrary to some of the fake news on the internet, I've never been kicked out of a mosque. I've never been bullied physically at a mosque. If you take these people on, they will ultimately melt away because they lose the arguments. I just had a debate against the head of the Muslim Public Affairs Council about the Muslim Reform Movement last January, sponsored by the World Affairs Council. We spent an hour and a half debating the platforms of our reform movement. I'm going to show you that in a second. And many Muslims who were in the organization came up to me and said, "I don't disagree with anything you said. I thought you were the devil before I sat and listened to you." And it's not about ideas. They prefer to demonize the messenger. And when you get to the ideas, their leaders become very weak and are abandoned. So how do we take them on? I think ultimately we realized that there was a major opportunity that happened across the Middle East in 2011. That opportunity is, make no mistake, as much as here in the United States we have the laboratory to do the work from Aspen to Phoenix to Washington that you just can't do in Egypt and Syria and Iraq. The problem, why it's not happening here, is because of over there. You really underestimate the influence of regimes in the Middle East if you believe they don't impact the behaviors and the ideas of Muslims here in Colorado and Phoenix and all over the world, especially in the West, because they have lobbyists, because they employ imams. The Turkish government right now, run by the AKP, which is the Muslim Brotherhood, has the Diyanet branch. The Diyanet is the religious services of the Turkish government. Do you know that the largest mosque now in the United States was just opened in Baltimore, Maryland, is the Diyanet Mosque? It's officially a Turkish mosque. The largest, it's a $10, $15 million mosque that was opened in Baltimore. And yet nobody seems to bat an eyelash because they are allies of the United States. I think they should be suspended from NATO, but that's a whole other conversation about policy, which we'll get into. But at the end of the day, this is what we're up against. And yet if you ask me, Zuhdi, what is the biggest obstacle to what we're up against? Apathy. It's not the left versus the right. It's not the media. Yeah, there are big symptoms and the problems. But the biggest obstacle is indifference. And especially in our Muslim community. So many of my Muslim colleagues agree with what we're doing. That's why actually, if there's one word you remember from me as you leave here, it's disruption. President Trump has been disruptive, and the Arab awakening was disruptive. There is a lot of catharsis and need sometimes to clean out the garbage and swamps and other things that we talk about, and disruption is the only way to do it. You can never have dictators leave because they want to modernize like MBS talks about. It's all a facade. It's all smoke and mirrors. They have had plans that they've lied about for decades, and they will continue to do so. This is a graph of all the countries involved in the religious wars in Europe in the 16th century for 30 years. 8 million people died in the religious wars in Europe for 30 years, in the 30 Years' War. That's where Islam is right now. So if you're operating under the presumption that we are going to get to a solution of reform through a organized handing over from the tribes, the House of Saud, the El-Sisis of the world are just going to step down. I can tell you my family in Syria, miles away from chemical weapons uses and ISIS and other things, will tell you that it is not going to happen peacefully. And yet, they felt more alive in the last 7 years of the revolution than they did in 60 years in the open-air prison of Hafiz and Bashar Assad. So there is no way to get to the peace that is democracy and secular liberalism. It's as if the West has this global amnesia and they forget how democracy came to us, as if it came peacefully and the religious men in robes walked away, said, no problem, you guys can have your democracy, see you later. That's not what the church did. They had songs of onward Christian soldiers, so the jihadists that are talking about advancing the Islamic states through militaries is something that I think we've seen before in history. I think it's important to lay out for you where the 14 centuries of Islam is. It's been divided into the land of Islam, or Dar al-Islam, and Dar al-Harb, or the land of war. And there have been some major historical shifts. And if you look at these shifts, they include dynasties. So initially, the initial hundreds of years of Islamic rule were not democracies, but they were dynasties. And yet, right now in the Sunni tradition, we have 4 schools of thought. There were 4,000 schools of thought in the 7th, 8th, 9th century, if not more. And professors and others can tell you about how much diversity there was, and that slowly went away. And then you had the Ottomans, which I think is one of the biggest things we're trying to repair, is we had 400 to 500 years of basically loss of ability to discuss the Quran in Arabic, the Arabic language. There was a militarization of society. So you lost what we call ijtihad, which is the discussion of Islam, critical interpretation of Scripture in light of modern day. Ijtihad, renewal of interpretation. Completely lost, even before the Ottomans. So this is part of what we're witnessing today. Then you had colonialism that in many ways brought some good things. My father was an Anglophile who believed in the French system, the British system that he learned about, studied in London, but also tried to impose foreign ideas on militaries and other things that is the reason today that you see the dictatorships and the corrupt militaries in every Arabic country, is because when the colonial powers left, it wasn't honorable like it is in America to join the military. The militaries were foreign entities, and they were nothing that anybody would want to sign up with. That's why you have the genocide happening in Syria and elsewhere, as these militaries are the worst dregs of humanity. And last, in the 20th century, in the post-colonial era, I think it was a good thing if Sykes-Picot and others divided these countries up. But ultimately, these countries that aren't that old, you know, you see Syrians cheering for their country in soccer matches and elsewhere, and Egyptians, these are pretty new countries. Saudi Arabia was handed to the House of Saud in 32 and others. So these national states are still grabbing onto what their identity means. And to you, from a historical perspective, the Erdogans of the world, Erdogan gave a speech 2 years ago in which he said he wants Sykes-Picot to go away. Not a surprise from an Islamist supremacist who wants the Ottoman Empire to come back, right? But also, the European formula of national identity being wedded to sort of race and history is not going to be a way to solve this, because the Arab nationalists, that's sort of their solution. The Egyptian military solution, the Iraqi military. America really has, I think, the only solution to this national identity problem, which is a belief that the identity of America is wedded to immigration, a universal American dream, and equality of all before the law, regardless of race, creed, religion, or national origin. This is something that, when I talk to Egyptians, I went to Egypt in 2013 and spoke to the Brotherhood leaders at the time when I was on the Commission on Religious Freedom. It was amazing to me. I asked them, what does Egyptianism mean to you? And to them it was, you know, the Islamic State and bringing the party's laws and giving Copts rights, because the Copts had rights under Islam rather than under God, under Islam, which is a very important distinction. So ultimately, these Islamo-nationalists believe that national identity is wedded to Islamic State identity. And these are what I call the Islamic mafia of the world, the leaders of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which are all variations on the same theme of Islamic domination. This map sort of shows you some of the countries with variant levels of Islamic states. The dark greens are Islamic states, both in name and in law. The light green, where Islam is the state religion and they have Sharia implemented. The tan countries have no declared religion whatsoever, and the blue are Islamic countries that are secular, but yet most of them are still dictatorships. This is an important thing to understand, which is ISIS didn't come out of thin air. You had politicians that were sloppy like Rand Paul who said, oh, Obama was the founding father of ISIS. That's nonsense. The founding father of ISIS is the ideologues of the Saudis and the Wahhabis, as you heard today. Yes, we might have helped some of the wrong people, but truly the radicalizers of the Syrian conflict were Turkey and Qatar, and the Saudis initially, and now they've completely pulled out. But Turkey and Qatar are still significantly contributing to it. But this issue of what is the repair of national identity is going to be, I think, a significant pathway towards solution. And Europe, remember now, is going through sort of a hyper-national swing. We are also. So the way you deal with this is also, and the way you engage Muslims in dealing with our hyper-nationalism because of the influx of refugees, should also map out how you help your Muslim friends in a tough love kind of way in dealing with national identity. And navigating and threading that needle is very important. These are post-revolution areas in which some countries like Libya, Tunisia completely overturned their governments. Syria is still in a rebellion, but it's dwindling down. And others, like the Saudis, had a bit of unrest, but they paid off their people with checks, and they then became quiet again. So it's not a binary equation. There's a gray area, and hopefully we can find that third pathway, which is liberty and freedom. I think this is the special sauce in America, if you will. It's not only our military that takes orders from a civilian government, which my grandparents told me was really why America worked, versus a military that gives orders to the civilian government. But the Establishment Clause. If you take a Muslim, no matter what they believe, no matter how Salafi they may be, Salaf is the friends of the Prophet, so Salafis are fundamentalists that believe in being very, very orthodox, however you want to interpret that. But if you take them and you tell them, you know what, the government should never establish religion, and it should never be in the business of putting into place Sharia, even they won't be a problem to your government, because they will argue things in government based on reason, not based on scriptural exegesis, which is very important. So if you want to reform, these are the key areas of reform. Ummah, what is Ummah? That's our faith community. In the Quran, it means state too. We have to dispense with that meaning. And the Islamic statecraft, that's why I took you through some of that history. Sharia, jihad, I'm going to talk to you about that in a second. Blasphemy laws, they tie free speech to sedition. So as long as you have an Islamic state, we have sedition laws in America. You have to, if somebody starts talking about armed rebellion against the Constitution, you have to have laws against some of that. They equate Islam to the government, therefore blasphemy and apostasy become offenses similar to any country that is trying to avoid overthrow. At the end of the day, as I mentioned to you, it's about identity. These are the Muslim Brotherhood legacy groups that exist in the United States. They're the alphabet soup. As Elham was showing her slides, I saw the MAS, which is the Muslim Brotherhood group in America, original group. It was discussed in the Chicago Tribune. They have a tarbiyah program, which is Arabic for upbringing of kids, youth programs. Go to the website on their tarbiyah program, and you will see what she was laying out for you as one of the elements of raising Muslim kids in America. But living in a democracy is not just about elections, it's not about majoritocracy, and it's not just about Muslims being a minority and having rights, but it's what they would do as majorities. So this is the issue, is that we're learning that the Arab awakening wasn't about the purple finger in Iraq. You know, as Ben Franklin, I think, said, democracy is 3 wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner, right? And so you can't have democracy unless you respect minority rights, unless minorities are felt to be equal and the rule of law ends with the Supreme Court. That's why, again, Americanism is the solution, because we're not a democracy, or we are a republic that has an electoral system that thankfully is not run by simply a majority, but is run by a separation of powers that ends in the Supreme Court. It's all about the team. As I mentioned, identity. You can take a sports analogy. You've got the jihadists that are on the field fighting, the Shia versus the Sunni, Hezbollah versus ISIS, if you will. And then you have the teams in the crowd like CARE and ISNA and others cheering them on for the end game, even though they might not believe in the violence. And then you have the folks at home sort of watching on TV passively, but yet cheering them on. And again, it's all about identity. There's this diagram I think is really important, which is about religious freedom. Forget about becoming experts in Islam. Think of everything as religious freedom. You've got global communities. So here's the 7+ billion people on the planet. Here. So where is religious freedom defended globally? Only 30% of the planet right now lives in countries that defend religious freedom. So you take China out of the equation, Russia out of the equation, Islamic majority countries out of the equation, you're left with Western countries, which is 30-40%. On top of that, you've got Muslim communities, which are 30-40%. This sliver of Muslims are basically the solution to what's happening in this community. So that's why Muslims living here in the West have a significant responsibility. You can't live in countries like Saudi Arabia and reform Islam. It's just not going to happen. It has to start in the West. Where is the civil rights battle of today? It's in the mosque. It is inside the mosque. So Muslims need to get a little hot under the collar. You know, they complain about Islamophobia, but again, our biggest obstacle is indifference and apathy. So as much as I don't want to see extreme groups and hate against my fellow Muslims, their apathy, their indifference to telling Americans that we want to defend and die for this country is creating a vacuum that empowers the far, what I don't like to call them the far right, the fascists, the bigots of the world, to feel that Islam is incompatible with the West. So we need to feel a little uncomfortable. We need to be disrupted. We need some fire hoses, if you will, that started the 60s and others. This is our website that talks about our mission statement of the separation of mosque and state. This statement from the Quran is on the front of our website. In Arabic, it sounds better. It's obviously from the Word of God, but it says, believers, conduct yourselves with justice, bear true witness before God, even if it be against yourselves, your parents, or your kin. In my book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam, I talk about that, but ultimately, that to us is our rallying cry, is that we do this from tough love. I'm labeled as anti-Muslim, when in fact, the Islamists think they're the only Muslims on the planet. There are other Muslims that just don't have enough energy or time or whatever it is. And this is our mission statement, is to advocate for the preservation of the founding principle of the U.S. Constitution, liberty and freedom, through the separation of mosque and state. And I was telling Alan earlier today that nobody understood why this was our mission statement until ISIS in 2013. And they said, oh, you're fighting ISIS. I'm like, no, ISIS is but one little symptom of the Islamic State disease. People talk about, and I love seeing Tawfik talk about music and art. There's a reason the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, the Muslim Brotherhood, are called the Ikhwan al-Muhandisin, which is the Brotherhood of Engineers. Most of them are, and I say this as a physician, are scientists that think in black and white terms versus artists and liberal thinkers and philosophers and poets and musicians. If you look, the Cornells, the Georgetowns, the Harvards of the world are opening branches of schools in Qatar and Dubai and Saudi Arabia, not in journalism and liberal arts, in medicine and engineering. And why do those governments? A medical school never really threatened. You know, you have an ophthalmologist now, one of the biggest genocidal dictators on the planet is Bashar Assad, right? So physicians, Zawahiri and others, right? So the issue is creating. And this mural, this is a website in Syria where they write poetry and art. They draw art on murals. The regime comes and takes it down, and then they redraw it over and over, and they're creating this memory, if you will, and they don't care what the regime does. It's sort of an anthology of human freedom and liberalism and ideas that really is what makes humanity live on. Islamism is the problem, whether it's the Shia flavor or the Sunni flavor. Don't make any mistake that somehow Shia advocates that come out as anti-brotherhood are somehow moderates. Hezbollah is anti-ISIS, and they're not any moderates. Same thing on the Sunni side. If you find a Sunni person that's anti-Khomeinist, that doesn't make them moderate, because sometimes it's more sectarian than it is really ideological. Last, this diagram, people say, well, who are your allies? And you've heard some of this today, but I think there is a continuum between secularists and theocrats. On each extreme, you've got the Assads, the secular militants, and you have the Al-Qaedas and ISISes, which violence by any means to get to their goal. In between, you have the non-violent majority of Muslims. You superimpose on that a worldview issue. Do they view the world in a liberal freedom kind of way, or do they view it in a theocratic way of establishing Islam? All of you, I hope, our national strategy should be focusing on right here. Let the military, the DOD, and others focus on these ends, the military threats. We're wasting too much time avoiding the real battle of ideas right here between this continuum. So the dogma should change from countering violent extremism, which I've never known what that means, and yet that's what most of your billions of tax money is being spent on, is CVE. Now, thankfully, the Trump administration has ended CVE, but they've not replaced it with anything. They've ended the CVE, but they've not replaced it. It needs to be replaced with CVI, countering violent Islamism. Yes, we can deal with other hate groups and call it whatever you want, countering violent, white supremacism, I don't care. But don't mix it all into one bucket. It's not the same disease. It's like going to an oncologist and expecting your oncologist to take care of your arrhythmia. It's a different problem. And yet they want to avoid political correctness, as our conference is called today, by calling it countering violent extremism. My book talks about a lot of my own background and in a more methodical and personal kind of way. And by the way, I put this picture of President Wahid's book from Indonesia, The Illusion of the Islamic State. We are not spontaneously combusted people that came out of nowhere and just sort of mutated from some gene. That we are not a minority either. As I showed you in that diagram, a majority of Muslims reject theocratic rule. We're a severe minority in the establishment among Muslim leaders. So last, and there's two messages I wanted to end on. One is social media, if you will, is the solution. And a lot of us have platforms on social media that we're trying to solve what we're doing. And yet we have a hard time getting traction because the filter systems on social media sees our work as hate far before it sees the radical Islamist work as hate. And yet when there were opportunities, and I want to jump to a slide quick here, when there were opportunities to fight for Islamic identity, the icons that you see before you is somebody from the Olympics like Ijtihad Muhammad, who wore a hijab but was a fencer, or Muhammad Ali or others, and yet the lady who won a gold medal who wore shorts and is not a Orthodox Muslim, nobody really heard of. And yet the woman who wore the hijab became the icon for the American Olympics. Muhammad Ali is a great guy. He's done a lot of philanthropic work, and yet his claim to fame as a Muslim is staying out of the draft, and Rand Paul wanted to honor him by creating an avoidance of the draft law, which is absurd. What a way to radicalize Muslims than to tell them that your greatest icon in history is someone who avoided going to war because he was a Muslim. That just makes no sense, and yet it's not politically correct. So last, you see many of the people familiar here, we took our declaration, we put it on the doors of the Saudi mosques and others, we mailed it to mosques. Here's our 2-page declaration. I've got about 50 copies or so with me. Take a look at it. It's a list of principles, 15 of them or so, that we agreed on, 12 of us, and said, if a Muslim believes in these things, the equality of men and women, the ability for people to make their own choices of Islamic interpretations, the stance against any violent jihad in general, all these concepts are in there, and it's pretty simple. It's not complicated. You don't have to get into the details of the Islamic recipe, if you will. And that will define for you, help you define who are the Muslims that are your allies versus those that are your enemies. And that should be used as sort of the strategy that we propose in helping enlarge our reform movement. And that declaration, we think, has been a successful, and by the way, if it could be defeated, I'm sure the Islamists would have argued against it, would have put websites saying how it shows that we reject our faith. And there is yet, correct, is that right, Raheel? I mean, there has yet to been one theological takedown of the principles that we spent 4 days in our founding meeting in Washington in December. What? With two imams, scholars that worked through the words and wordsmithed it to bring us to where we are. In the end, after the Manchester bombing, we reached out to Ariana Grande and we said, you have a platform here. I put out a video and said, instead of this pablum that she put out, which was, we're all here together, etc., please join us. She was on a tour called the Dangerous Woman Tour. Tens, if not more, were killed. Hundreds were injured as they were bombed leaving her concert. And yet not one mention of the misogynistic, anti-Semitic, radical Islamists that attacked her concert, and yet her verbiage ignored it. And yet these same celebrities, after every other attack, are all over the NRA and other gun issues, etc. They're not afraid to say who the enemy is when it's in the United States, but yet when it deals with global radical Islam, they protect it from the platforms that we would be their greatest allies in protecting gay rights, women's rights, etc., that they wanted to avoid. And I give you this to end on because our Muslim reform movement would be on steroids if celebrities, the Hakeem Olajuwons of the world, the Ariana Grandes, others, would start at least giving us time and platforms and saying, these are the Muslims I want to support. And yet when we talk to them, they're so afraid of political correctness, they're afraid of governments that don't want to endorse them anymore, that they often will ignore us. And I think this is the elephant in the room, if you will. So our legacy is about not only the 10 of us or however many of us there are, but empowering you. And the solutions from your perspective are the following, and I'm going to give you 5 and then step down. Change the topics from radical Islam and terrorism to secular governance, and women's rights. Those 2 things. Change it always to those 2 topics, women's rights and secular governance. Second, connect the regimes to the Muslim organizations here and demand that Muslim leaders here renounce those regimes and what their ideas are, because that'll always, I think, expose what they are. Ask Muslims what they're for, not only what they're against. Anyone can condemn terrorism, but what are they for when it comes to things when they're a majority? Work with universities, institutes, Aspen institutes, your politicians. You're seeing more and more Muslims running for office, and yet it seems to be coming from one party, which is based on identity politics, rather than the other party and others. So we need to have more diverse Muslims, not getting elected just because they wear the badge of being Muslim, but because they're reformers. Look at it not in a binary way. Engage your faith leaders in religious institutions like this, in universities, in academics, and in communities to begin to have this conversation. Because, you know, to me it's amazing that a country founded on fighting against theocrats can't seem to have a functional national conversation about theocracy. I don't get it. Thank you.
Thank you, Zuhdi. And last but not the least, we have a fellow Canadian with us. He is the vice president of my organization, the Council for Muslims Facing Tomorrow, also a professor of political science at the University of Western Ontario. And he has written a very thought-provoking book called The Quran Problem and Islamism, in which he has addressed the key issue of the rise of anti-Semitism in the Muslim world, which of course impacts all of us. Salim Mansur is a survivor and witness of Muslim-on-Muslim violence and ethnic cleansing in the 1971 war and genocide in Bangladesh, formerly East Pakistan. It gives me great pleasure to invite Salim Mansur up here. And after this, please stay here and we will have all of us on stage so you can ask questions.
Shalom. Thank you, Dr. Altman, and of course Raheel, my sister, for putting the effort and the time and the energy to organize this. It's so wonderful to be here. And I just cannot help think and share with you, in paraphrase, the words of one of the greatest poets of the Muslim world, and I believe, in English translation, the best-selling poet in America from the 13th century, Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi of Konya, Turkey, who said, if you want to be in paradise, this is it, this is it, this is it, the world. Here it is in Aspen. So thank you for having us here in Aspen. Thank you to each one of you. My own remarks in the time that we have, in the limited time that from a busy day you have taken to come out, will be to zoom out from the granular details of discussion my friends have done. You know, they bring immense talents as professionals, doctors and engineers who we run down occasionally, but their minds are tuned to, as you heard from Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, to come up with not only talking about a problem, what are the solutions. I will zoom out of that granular discussion. I want to take my time, the few minutes that I have, and share with you in terms of what is this all about. Put it in a historical context and provide you with a perspective. Why, in talking about what we're talking about today, we're talking about ourselves, all of us. And I want to begin with a little story. It's a story which I heard as a child. It's a very popular or well-known story across the Muslim world. It doesn't matter within which regional or local culture you are, you hear this story. And I heard it as a child, and it goes back in time. And the story is, very quickly, it's about a sheikh, a religious teacher, attached to a mosque, who decides to go to the West for a period of time. And in those days, traveling was not like as I jetted into Aspen yesterday. It was a commitment to travel, to make the journey, to go away. And then you didn't return immediately. So this sheikh goes away, and his journey is from a part of the Muslim world to Europe, to Britain and France, where he spends a substantive period of time, and then he comes back, and he's back in his madrasa, in his school, and the students and everybody else are very eager to hear him speak and to tell them about his experience. And so they ask him, oh, Sheikh, you spent your time in Britain and France. Tell us, what is your experience? What did you learn? And the Sheikh says, you know, I was there in England for so many months, and I was there in France for so many months. And it struck me, I realized that I was within Islam. And now I'm back with you. I'm back to my own country, to my own home. And I wake up and I realize that I'm among Muslims, but there is no Islam. So if we sit and think and ponder about that story, we'll leave it to you that. The subject of and the issue surrounding Islamic reform that we have been talking about, as the story indicates, is old, even as they have emerged in recent years with some urgency. It would be more proper to speak about reform of Muslim culture, whether it is Arab or non-Arab. For whatever is Islam in history and however Islam is received, understood, practiced, and made the template of cultures and civilization, Arab, Persian, Turkish, Indian, Javanese, Islam is at the human level a reflection of the conduct of Muslims. Islamic reform or reformation, analogous to the Christian Reformation, is neither an event nor an instant or a moment in time. It is instead a process spread across time and space, people and geography, non-linear in movement, at times violent and ugly, and never entirely predictable. The Quran sets an imperative tone on the need for reform by insisting that it must come from within people themselves. A well-cited verse of the Quran states, God does not change the state of a people till they change themselves. Now, Muslim concerns about reform and renewal reach back into the early years of the birth of the modern age, or the late 18th century. These concerns emerge with the military defeats dealt by an expanding Russian Empire of the Tsars and the rulers of the Ottoman Empire, who were also, as Caliph, the religious leaders of Muslims. Since then, from the late 18th century, we find increasing reflection in Muslim writings on the effort to understand and explain these military defeats that mark the beginning of the reversals of the fortune of Islamic civilization after nearly a millennium of growth, expansion, and relative prosperity. Hence, the present-day concerns about Islamic reform has a rich antecedent in Muslim history. Bernard Lewis, who we recently lost, was, to most people who will agree, the preeminent Western historian of Islam and Muslims. In his now classic book, The Emergence of Modern Turkey, discussed extensively the efforts of the Ottoman rulers known as Tanzimat during the first half of the 19th century to introduce administrative and military reforms after the fashion of the European powers. Most reputable historians in the West, among them Marshall Hodgson, Hamilton Gibb, Wilfred Campbell Smith, William R. Polk, who has just published a fascinating book, some 500 pages in length, which I'm just beginning to read, called Crusade and Jihad, for instance. Albert Hourani, and there's another very recent book that has been published by another very notable historian, Christopher de Beleg, titled In the Islamic Enlightenment, The Struggle Between Faith and Reason, 1798 to Modern Time. They've all been investigating the struggle for reform within the Muslim world and its consequences. It is a liberal assumption that reform means a movement of a people, spontaneous or organized, that is progressive from a situation that is less to more, from less of knowledge of ourselves and of our world to more, from less freedom to more, from less of science and democracy and equality among people to more, etc. Rarely do we question this assumption, and rarely do we take the trouble to recognize that if reform is synonymous with progress, then why has there been so much resistance by so many in the forward and progressive movement of history from less to more? This is a puzzling and paradoxical question that we should all keep in mind. Among Muslims, the idea of reform and renewal has generated two contradictory lines of thinking and activism to deal with the problem recognized by most Muslims that the situation of the Muslim world relative to the West has materially worsened, and consequently the civilization is in a state of disrepair or broken. For instance, Marshall Hodgson noted, quote, in the 16th century of our era, of our common era, a visitor from Mars might well have supposed that the human world was on the verge of becoming Muslim. In the 16th century, the Muslim peoples taken collectively were at the peak of their power. By the end of the 18th century, they were prostrate. Once this worsening of the situation could not be obscured and denied, Muslims had to offer an explanation for it and a remedy to mend it. In terms of explanation, Abdus Salam, a physicist of Indo-Pakistani origin, and only one of two Muslims to be awarded the Nobel Prize in Science, observed that around the middle of the 17th century, Europe and the Muslim world were about equal, as symbolized by the two monuments erected at about the same time: the Taj Mahal in Agra, India, and the St. Paul's Cathedral in London, England. But, as Salim points out, within a generation, quote, there was also created, and this time only in the West, a third monument, a monument still greater in its eventual import for humanity's future. This was Newton's Principia, published in 1687. Newton's work had no counterpart in the India of the Mughals, and I might add, none was offered from any other part of the Muslim world. A civilizational breach as a result was opened between the West and the Muslim world, and this has continued to widen, leaving the present generation of Muslims, that is us, with the problem that the gap has become so vast it is likely unbridgeable. The two contradictory, therefore, reformist thinking or approaches among Muslims are: one, to pursue reform by emulating the West in terms of politics and science, in effect some variant of soft or hard version of what we know of the effort behind the Ottoman Tanzimat; and two, to seek a return to the imagined past of Muslim or Islamic glory by reconstituting Muslim societies along the lines of the imagined pristine Islam of the Salaf that we have heard about, the righteous ancestors, according to Muslims, belonging to the first three generations following the Prophet. In the one instance, Muslims look forward to building a future whose image in terms of politics and science is provided by the West. In a sense, West is the mirror of the direction that the Muslim world should be heading or wants to head. And in the other instance, Muslims seek as remedy for the present condition by looking to the past and reclaiming it as the means to repair the broken civilization. For the past 100 years, the Muslim world has been trapped by the conflict between the two contradictory approaches to the question of reform. In 1918, the Ottoman Empire, allied with Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire during World War I, was defeated by the Allied powers of Britain, France, and the United States. Defeat was followed by dismantling of what remained of the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East, the rise of modern Turkey under Mustafa Kemal, and after 13 centuries, the abolition of the Caliphate, the central institution of traditional Islam. As William Butler Yeats, the great Irish poet, wrote, "Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world." For the Muslim, the collapse of the center of the Muslim world, that is the Caliphate, opened a void, and anarchy or conflict that followed has continued into a present time. The heart of this conflict is about what sort of politics is to prevail. A politics of reform that seeks reconciliation with and embrace of the modern world, or the sort of reform that rejects the politics of the modern world in favor of a return to the path of the Salaf and an imagined pristine Islam. Now, if you look at that framework which I've just presented, I will enumerate that framework with the following points. Implicit in the above discussion over Islamic reform, which we are all engaged in, whether as Muslims or as non-Muslims, is the question, which is the principal impediment for reform? Is it Islam as religion, or is it Muslim culture in general? I submit to you, it is culture. The Muslim world is not monolithic. It is instead immensely diverse in terms of ethnicity, languages, local and regional cultures. The Arab component of the Muslim world is about a fifth in terms of demography, while nearly 4/5 of the Muslim world is non-Arab. And the largest portion of this population is in the Asia-Pacific region, with Indonesia as the largest Muslim country, followed by Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. This reality is readily ignored. For instance, in the map that my friend Zuhdi had of the Muslim world, India was missing. It was gray. 200 million Muslims in India. India is the world's largest functioning democracy, and without Muslims, India wouldn't be a democracy. Or without Muslim contribution, India wouldn't be a democracy. 3, while the Arab-speaking dimension of the Muslim world is a relatively small part of the larger picture, the sacred text of Islam, the Quran, is in Arabic, and Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, was an Arab, and the origin of Islamic history resides with the Arabs. These facts have meant that the Arabs have been instrumental in giving historical shape to Islam as it came to be understood and practiced both in terms of religion and politics that followed. 4, the entire Muslim world, or presently the member states of the Organization of Islamic Conference, which again my dear friend Zuhdi quite correctly says the Muslim Mafia, are located geographically within the belt between the two tropics and belong to what was until recently designated as the Third World. The designation signifies underdevelopment in terms of economy, technology, politics, and taken all together in terms of culture relative to the West designated as the First World. Islam as a religious impulse, a revelation, a pure and transcendental idea uncontaminated by history of any kind, is a belief simply in one everlasting God as the creator of heavens and earth and all things therein. The doctrinal creed of Islam, or the Muslim faith, is a very simple statement. There is no God but God, in Arabic, Allah. And the secondary clause that follows, Muhammad is his messenger. The principal phrase is similar, if not identical, to the doctrinal creed of Judaism, or the Jewish declaration of faith, which I won't repeat it to you all know it, the Shema. The Islamic impulse or revelation, at first felt by or given to Muhammad, became embedded in the culture of the pagan Arabs among whom the Prophet was born and who were the first people to submit to Islam. In other words, submission came as a result of the eventual defeat of those pagan Arabs who made war on the Prophet and his small coterie of followers, and to which the Quran alludes to in one of the verses that states that these desert Arabs submitted to the Prophet's message, that is the worship of one God, once they were defeated by him without faith or belief entering their hearts. These pagan Arabs, as Muslims, spread Islam principally by the sword at a rapid pace, unprecedented in world history in the making of an empire and a civilization. The eventual conversion of non-Muslims into Islam occurred over time when people under Muslim rulers gravitated towards those in power representing success in material terms, or as a result of the appeal of Islam across ethnic or racial division as a monotheistic religion. 7, the high noon of Islam as a civilization was between the 8th and the 15th century. That is the late antiquity and the Middle Age. Islam as a civilization was pre-modern, and its failure to make the transition to modernity has meant it remains a pre-modern construct in terms of the worldview of its followers as a people, Muslims, defined by their faith tradition. The characteristic of pre-modern culture is one of kinship relationships, and it is tribal in structure. Islam as an essence, as a monotheistic religion, is not tribalism of any sort. Indeed, Islam transcends tribes and tribalism, and emphasizes universalism as the essential feature of mankind for individuals to embrace. But Islam in history, and so we have to separate Islam in history as opposed to Islam as an idea. Islam in history became embedded in the tribalism of the Arabs of the desert, and as a faith tradition, Islam came to be shaped by the pre-modern culture of Arabs and those who followed them in the history of Muslims as a people. Tribalism is by nature collectivist, based on group identity, in which the idea of individual as an entity, free and autonomous, is non-existent or abhorrent as harmful to the collective identity and interests of the tribe. 9, the modern world makes its break from the pre-modern world, which began in Europe, culturally, in terms of individual freedom and the rights of individual to be free as equals. This cultural break defines the politics of the modern world, and it takes meaning in terms of the new philosophy as a result of the scientific revolution, and is given form in terms of democracy based on the rights of individuals as a free people. Now, the United States that Zuhdi talked about is the child of this great breakthrough that happened in the making of the modern world. 10, the impulse or revelation of Islam, that is the belief in one everlasting God, is not qualified or limited by any intrinsic feature or outward form to make it resistant to the reality of the modern world of science and democracy. Hence, any individual belonging to the modern world culture, by birth or by choice, can accept Islam without any unease of the mind if the simplicity of the Islamic belief and its universal appeal is found attractive to the needs of the heart in terms of faith that is enduring. And I can run through this whole afternoon with names of people, individuals of the West, who at a point in their life came to embrace Islam. But they're Western in culture. They're part of the West. They're not Arabs, they're not Indians, they're not Javanese, etc., etc. So the above enumerated observations are merely indicative and not exhaustive of the challenge of Islamic reform in our time. The requirements of Christian Reformation were many, but one that proved to be critical was the discarding of the pre-modern worldview that was collectivist for the modern worldview that empowered the individual as the motive force for change. This was symbolized, for instance, by the struggle of Galileo against the teachings of the church when it came to matters of science based on observation and experiment. Both groups of Muslims, those who seek to emulate the West in finding remedy for the Muslim world's state of disrepair, and those who seek a return to the imagined glorious past of Islam's venerated ancestors, the Salaf, are agreed that a better textual understanding of the Quran will support their respective positions. Which reading of the Quran supports which remedy as Islamic reform, since the two approaches are contradictory, rest entirely on the respective worldviews of Muslims engaged in this effort. Hence, the subject of Islamic reform is inherently paradoxical because the Quran is open to many readings, as I have discussed in my recent book, and the many readings are legitimate from the essentially Islamic doctrinal point of view because the core doctrine of Islam is not bound by any cultural specificity, tribal or non-tribal, pre-modern or modern, for the belief in one God everlasting is transcendent and universal. In concluding, it might be suggested that the present tumult of the Muslim world is indicative of the immensity of the ongoing struggle for reform. It might also be suggested that in appearance it seems those seeking the return of the Muslim world to the imagined past of the Salaf have the upper hand given their tendency to use violence to impose their views on others, Muslims and non-Muslims alike. But appearance is deceptive. On the contrary, it might be suggested that the deeper is the penetration of the features of modernity, both materially and in terms of ideas, into the Muslim world, the reform of the Muslim world, or Islamic reform, will eventually reach a critical point and lead from a quantitative to a qualitative shift in the culture of Islam or Muslims in general, from pre-modern to modern. And the degree of resistance to this reality of modernity penetrating deeper into the Muslim world, signified by the level of violence, is, ironically, indicative of the historically losing effort on the part of those mounting the resistance, such as the Taliban in Afghanistan, or the ISIS in Iraq and Syria, or the isolated and fragmented cells of homicidal jihadis or terrorists, making war indiscriminately against people who overwhelmingly, by choice, like all of us in this room, are inclined to be modern, whether Muslim or not Muslim, in terms of the politics and culture. So what I see that is going on, that we have been discussing this afternoon, why did I take it off? Is, as in a sense, to draw upon an American analogy to end this discussion, or my part of it, is like the battles or the wars or the tribal conflicts of the North American Indians in resistance to what was happening in North America over a whole period of time. You know, of course, it has now become very fashionable to talk about, in a reverse sense, of how the white man or how the modern people obliterated the Indians in this instance. But again, that's part of history, you know. And that's what is happening in the Muslim world, except that that violence or resistance to modernity has been exported out into the West, with which now you have become involved. You didn't want a part of it, but you have become involved in it. Thank you.
I won't be offended by the people leaving just because I came on stage. So thank you for those who have stayed. I'll keep my comments very short. I wanted to talk about the challenges we face as reformist Muslims and in the work we do. And one of the greatest challenges we face, I am a mother and a grandmother, I'm a supporter of women's rights in Muslim majority societies. And Dr. Manea and I were talking about this yesterday, that whenever there is a rise in radicalization, whenever there is a rise in extremism and fundamentalism across the globe, the crux of it falls upon the women. And this is what we are seeing in parts of the Muslim world. I had mentioned to you that when I was growing up as a child, it was very different. It was a modern country, but I have slowly seen the oppression of women and the restrictions on women and the forced clothing being forced on women. We see what's happening on the streets of Iran today. We are in 2018, and women are being jailed and arrested and tortured for uncovering their hair on the streets. And where is this feminist movement that it goes out? Where is the Million Women's March when there is honor-based violence in Muslim majority societies, honor killings, female genital mutilation? By the way, there are over 50,000 cases right here in the United States. It's not just something that's happening out there. It's happening in the Western world. And this is what our speaker said. when they said that this is our problem. It impacts all of us because it's happening right here. And so we are faced with these challenges. We are faced by the pushback from both sides. We are faced with governments who are in bed with the dictatorships and the oil-rich governments for the sake of oil. So last year, I was invited to the US Congress to give testimony to the Committee on Homegrown Terrorism. And I made some very basic recommendations, which I will share with you here. I said they should ban the Muslim Brotherhood. If the United Arab Emirates, a Muslim country, can ban the Muslim Brotherhood, certainly the United States can. They should stop foreign funding coming from these oil-rich states into our universities, into institutions, into organizations, because with all this come subversive agendas. When you track the money, you know exactly where it's coming from. Everything that you have heard, Dr. Manea talked about the syllabus, Tawfik talked about the jihadi teachings. All of this is being exported to the West on the backs of billions of petrodollars. So we've got to stop that funding coming into this country, and that's part of what the challenges that we face. But I'm an eternal optimist. I don't like to leave on a low note. We've heard the problems. I want to share with you some of the progress that has been made in the work that we do. And we work in partnership with anyone who shares our mission and our vision, because we've learned that this is a problem that impacts all of us. At our organization, the Council for Muslims Facing Tomorrow, we follow a mandate of the 3 E's. We say you have to expose the problem, which is what we're trying to do. You have to educate the masses, and then you have to eradicate the problem. The problem of a jihadi ideology is unfortunately not something that you can sit around a dining table and have a warm, fluffy conversation. It is something that is a virus that needs to be eradicated. There are many Western leaders, including my own, who thinks that smiling and taking selfies and inviting ISIS people back into the country and having warm, fuzzy conversations with them is going to solve the problem. But let me tell you that I met a Yazidi girl there. We have lobbied privately with groups in Canada and brought in Yazidi victims of ISIS. I met a Yazidi girl who had been raped and tortured, and she saw her ISIS rapist and torturer on a bus in Canada. And when she went to the refugee camp where she was living and reported it, they said, no, this must be your imagination, don't talk about it. So bringing back ISIS fighters is not the solution to the problem. And so we have to be a little more cognizant of the level of the issue and how we are going to deal with it. But as I said, leave you on a high note. Let me share with you some of the places where we have made an impact. And the question always arises, and I've been asked time and again, does the work that we do, we are Westerners, we live in Canada or America or Europe, we have the safety and security of these countries to do the work that we do. Does this impact Muslim majority societies? Yes, it does, because we live in the world of the internet. You know, this should be not just the internal struggle, but the internet struggle for the soul of Islam. We're living in a global village. Everything we do here impacts our sisters and brothers and the people who are struggling on the ground. Our activism does help them. And I'll share with you, we in our organization have a grassroots program in Bangladesh. Bangladesh is the 4th largest Muslim majority society. There is a large, there are many thousands of villages in Bangladesh. Through a simple donation of $50 a month, some videos in the local language and books in the local languages by an expert on Sharia who sits on our board of directors and is a Bangladeshi. He has made docudramas in Bangladeshi. We have managed to de-radicalize 28 villages in Bangladesh. And by de-radicalize, I mean that they have put a banner at the mouth of the village saying de-radicalized village. And in some cases, the women have thrown out the imam of the mosque and told him that everything you were telling us was nonsense. We now know better, because they were being fed Thank you. So, and we've got 85 more villages targeted. There are volunteers and activists on the ground who keep getting jailed, who keep getting beaten up, but they go into these villages where sometimes there is no electricity. And they take a generator, one camera, one TV, and a video, and they show it in the village square. So these grassroots activities do make a difference. You may be aware in Tunisia, the women of Tunisia got a law passed which allowed Muslim women to marry non-Muslim men. And those of you who know Sharia know that this is impossible under Sharia. But even in Western countries, it's not allowed, but they managed to get this law. In Morocco, it is the women who changed the law that allowed polygamy and gave the man the rights to indiscriminately marry more than one woman. They got a limitation put into it. What I'm trying to say to you, obviously, is very clear. There is a lot of change that is coming that is headed by women. Not only women, we of course can't work without the support of the wonderful men here, but the women are bringing about a lot of changes in these countries. Once you educate and empower the woman, we have a saying in Pakistan that if you educate a boy, you educate an individual. When you educate a girl, you educate a family, you educate a village, you educate a tribe, you educate the country, and then you educate the world. And we are talking about countries where education of girls is not a primary concern. We've just heard a story about, we've got a new prime minister in Pakistan, but 10 girls' schools were burned down. So we have people like Malala Yousafzai, a heroine from Pakistan, who is a foundation that is helping building schools. So with education and economic empowerment and enlightenment and vision and support, we can bring about these changes. In Egypt, where female genital mutilation was at its highest in terms of percentage, with the Clarion Project, we had a program where we found an Egyptian lawyer by the name of Reda El-Danbouki, who managed to file the first case against parents who allowed their daughter to get female genital mutilation, and he was prosecuted. And I share this with you to show that there are changes that are happening there when we work in collaboration with other countries. With the rise of anti-Semitism in the Muslim world, the rise of radicalization is directly collaborating with the rise of anti-Semitism across the Muslim world, which is based on identity politics, on insecurities, on politics not based on the core of the faith. But at Muslims Facing Tomorrow, we host a program every year on Holocaust Education Week. And we do this in collaboration with the Holocaust Education Studies program. And this is to talk about how Muslims and Jews can live together in peace and harmony. This is not interfaith dialogue, warm, fluffy stuff. No, this is hard information. We talk about the real issues. We talk about the pink elephant in the room. We don't shy back. And I'm sure that you have understood that we've been very open and clear about these problems. Again, in collaboration with the Clarion Project, we now have a webinar and a campaign to try and get to the youth before they are radicalized. It's called Building Resilience. I've been doing webinars online about this to teach teachers, educators, counselors, police, law enforcement, and those involved with youth how they can look for the signs of radicalization and how they can intervene before the youth are radicalized. I won't go on, but I want to quickly share, because of Dr. Manea's book on Sharia and women, in which she studied the impact of Sharia councils in England. So we have to also take into consideration when Western governments have looked the other way, when policymakers, leaders have supported the so-called radicals in our midst, when organizations like CARE and ISNA and Muslim Brotherhood known affiliates are allowed to say that they are the voice of the Muslims, which they are not. This is what happens. In the United Kingdom, in England, there are 85 known Sharia courts that exist. And this has been done with the blessing of the British government. And it has gone on for the last 40 years. And the British House of Lords and the House of Commons looked the other way until Baroness Caroline Cox, a brilliant, brilliant MP in England, reached out to me across the Atlantic and said, can you come and speak to the House of Lords and Commons and tell, excuse the terminology, these old white men what they have done? And I did, although I wondered why she wanted me all the way. I did. I went for 3 years. We went and lobbied and rallied and brought in the victims of the Sharia courts. Well, 2 weeks ago, you know, what was happening before was that most Muslim couples who were wed in religious ceremonies did not register their marriages in civil courts. The Sharia courts told them, this is enough. You've had a religious marriage. You don't need to go to the civil courts. As a result, when the man said, I divorced you 3 times, which, by the way, is not supposed to be the way that divorce takes place, the woman was left in limbo with nothing. When she went to the civil court, they didn't recognize that marriage. Well, they've overruled that ruling, and now the Sharia marriages are accepted in British courts, and the women are getting their rights. And this is why we lobby for all the work that we do, and this is why we need your support, and this is why we're so thankful that you are here today. Each and every one of you here is an ambassador for the message of Reform Islam. Next time someone says to you, all Muslims are terrorists, you mention our names, and you say, no, they're not. And you support us in our work. And before I leave, I want to just mention, and if Richard Green could just stand up for a moment, we have here the executive director and co-founder of the Clarion Project. And the reason I was having him stand up is that he has offered copies of Honor Diaries, which is a documentary about honor-based violence, brilliant award-winning documentary. The Third Jihad, in which Dr. Zuhdi Jasser has made an appearance. And did you say Obsession? If they want it, please talk to him, and he will arrange for a copy to be sent to you. So, don't go away. Let's get all your questions out here. Thank you so much, each and every one of you.
So we'll ask you to stay around for these questions. It will not be just questions, it will be discussion. It'll be discussion between our speakers. Let us just put the chairs up. We're just going to do a sound check. Only one mic. We don't have a second handheld? Really? Okay. Yes, please. You all checked? Come on up, please. No. I have been asked a couple of times during the event, will there be a video taping available? We have taped the entire conference, and we will continue through this discussion. And that will be available on all of their websites, all of their organizations, also on the Aspen Chabad JCC website. We will get this information out to you, or if we don't, please feel free to call here to speak with our Inga Johnson, and she will help you out. What we would ask of you, I think we've all been incredibly impressed by this presentation. Feed it out, pass it forward, get it to your friends. Help them understand what we've learned here today. Now, I would like to ask the first question to stimulate the first part of discussion by asking about the fate of women in Islam, and you've discussed some of it, but from the point of view of the Western and specifically the American feminist culture, which to my dismay and great shock over the past 2 decades has not said a peep about what's going on and the struggles of women in Islam. And is it because they feel, gee, you know, it's a cultural thing, we don't want to mess with other people's culture? I would like all of you to try and discuss and or answer this conundrum that I have. Elham, let's start with you first, please.
Thank you.
And feel free to interrupt one another as you did last night at dinner, please.
Let's just not shout at each other, okay?
Yeah, no shouting.
No, thank you very much. I think it's a very important question. In Women in Sharia Law, the book, I mentioned a paradigm I call the Essentialist Paradigm, where you see what I called a white woman's, a white man's, white woman's burden. The feel of guilt, the feel of responsibility about colonialism, problems that were caused by certain Western countries. And that guilt would be more or less like a burden used in a way that makes them think we have to protect. And they would like to protect a minority. And that is noble. Nevertheless, they tend to look at people, look at this diversity in this group, as one. They tend to see in us only a religious identity. And at the same time, they seem to think you have certain authentic voices that speak for this religion. And we end up in a situation where you have the authentics who are more or less none other than the Islamists, who are setting the course of what is Islamic, what should be protected. In many countries, including also in North American and European countries, you have many problems that are caused not only by religion, but also by culture, okay? Within many minority groups, including the Muslim groups. And the problem is basically many feminists, and I'm not saying all, here in the West seem to think by talking about these problems in a differentiated way, finding solutions, we stigmatize these minorities. Now, with all due respect, it's like, thank God that we are mature enough to fight for our own rights. Yeah. We are fighting for our rights. Just don't make it difficult for us by coming and saying, don't speak about these problems. You're stigmatizing a community. Well, what about the women, the children, the people of different ideas who are basically within these communities are suffering? What about the consequences? Like in the Sharia course in the UK, what about the consequences?
Yeah, I think, you know, there's probably one of the themes that runs center to this is the fact that the center of access of 99% of the conversations in America are about partisan politics, how we can use the issue. You know, for example, I've talked to some of my conservative friends, you know, me being on the right side of the aisle, telling them, do you realize that the Islamic groups that you're working with on your anti-gay agenda, your anti-abortion rights, pro-life agenda, those are the only two issues they share with you. Everything else, they're completely against you, whether it's women's rights, whether it's secular governance, all these other things, they're not working with. They're like, well, we're going to turn a blind eye. I've talked to them about the school choice. I'm very much involved in the school choice issue in Arizona. There's a couple Islamic schools that are very problematic, and yet there's a fear that if we open up the can of worms of what's actually being taught at Islamic private schools, that the entire school choice program will suffer and the left will use it in order to destroy the school choice issue. So this is the problem, is that women's issues. The second issue, I think, is celebritization of Islam, which is the Queen Noors and the sort of Casablanca approach to Islam is well, as long as, you know, we saw this with the royal family even in Britain. You approach the royal families in Saudi Arabia, etc. It's all very beautiful and, you know, sort of fits the Hollywood mentality, and they sort of ignore the common woman, the common human being on the streets in these countries that are done a huge disservice. We saw that with Assad. Vogue had a whole layout on you know, Hitler's wife, you know, Esma Assad, and they didn't really care about what was happening in their country. Even folks like Baroness Cox, who you mentioned, wonderful lady doing great work, yet from the floor of the parliament, she said Assad is a friend of the West and was working. So even folks that are working with us on the Islamist issue, because of geopolitics or whatever, they see the ends justifying the means and aren't applying, you know, some of the same principles to that. Louis Farrakhan, another great example. How many women are leading the Nation of Islam, and yet he has millions of followers on Facebook, and yet all we hear about filtering social media are the few hundred people carrying tiki torches in Virginia, and yet the hundreds of thousands spreading vile anti-Semitism in the Nation of Islam, we can't shut down their Facebook pages, even though they're talking about the annihilation of Jews, the denial of the Holocaust, and their misogyny in the Nation of Islam, where there's no women that have any representation. And yet Louis Farrakhan continues to have complete open Facebook access, while the big problem is supposedly the guys carrying tiki torches that are a few hundred that seem to be the focus of the media. So it's sort of a bizarre approach.
Yeah, I may add just two minor points. One of them is related to the concept of protecting. They think they are protecting minority or when they don't want to interfere or talk about the issue. In fact, they are doing the opposite. If you really want to protect the Muslim minority, you fight radicalism. You fight the disease of radicalism to protect them from the consequences of this ideology. If you want them to protect their own lives, they don't go to do suicide bombing, they don't become barbarians like ISIS, you fight radicalism. So they took it the other way around. If they really care about a minority, they should probably care about this disease and understand they must fight it. This is number one. Number two is, I think sometimes selfishness among some people. They don't care about anything until or unless it touches them in person. It's like when people ignored the Jews during the Nazi Germany, and then it turned it to be, ultimately it was going to affect others as well. So I think some element of selfishness here by ignoring things. If it's not touching me in person, I don't care about you. And that is a way of thinking that I believe many, if not or some, probably, I don't know the percentage, in this maybe feminist groups need to understand. They need to understand their fellow human being also is like themselves. And what happens there can happen to me here one day. Thank you.
Does it say somewhere in the Quran how to beat your wife properly?
There is a verse in the Quran that talks about, uses the word وَضْرِبُهُنَّ, which means beating women. And it was understood in this way traditionally in almost every Sharia book, by all Islamic jurisprudence book without exception. And it was seen as a traditional teaching by many Muslims, if not most. They accept the principle. And the situations that I tried in this modern commentary, I put a different way of interpretation that can protect women and prevent using the Quran to use violence against them. That is a theological issue, and I managed to do it. It's complex theological issue. You know, with theology there is some complexity, but I managed to do it. But I have to admit, it exists. And the things are complicated not because not many people try to change this, and women are so suppressed mentally and afraid even of questioning this. Maha, my wife, used to wear the hijab, the Islamic hijab, and I actually, one of the reasons why I married her, why she was wearing the hijab, and I refused to have music in my wedding to this degree. So she and many others are so scared, were so scared to even question the concept of beating, or to try to understand the Quran at a different level, the concept level rather than later. They were so scared even to touch it, because the moment they touch an area in theology, they feel they will be tortured in hell forever. And
But we spent a lot of time today talking about the fact, when we're talking about radicalization, you have all mentioned that the Quran is open to different interpretations. Am I
Yeah,
correct?
so that
Okay.
but the mainstream one accepts this. The mainstream
Okay,
current.
one second. So you've said that it's open to interpretation.
Yeah.
Now, there are some female scholars who have interpreted that particular verse of the Quran to meaning, to saying that that word has more than one meaning and it means move away.
Yeah, so idrub or dar, and there's disagreement on our panel about
Yeah.
that, but let me get my point of view out on this, which is what Raheel is talking about. Just like in English, the word go on strike, if you work for a union and you go on strike, in Arabic it's the same word, dariba. So original classical Arabic, that passage and the context of the entire passage talks about if a couple cannot get along, in the end, separation is appropriate, if not divorce. So Islam permits divorce, it permits separation. So the word for separation or go on strike from your marriage was intentionally used, the colloquial interpretation, which is to hit, strike, versus strike, go on strike, which means separate.
That's great.
That's,
great.
I mean,
But
I
this
didn't
is-
make that up.
But
Those are
this
Islamic
is
scholars
a
that have said
new
that.
interpretation. If you went to traditional mainstream interpretations,
Oh, that's true, yeah.
you will not find this interpretation. This is something new that happened after the criticism and the critique that occurred.
But isn't that
Many
what
I'm
we-
happy with this. No, don't get me wrong. I am so glad that this is happening. But I have to tell people also the truth, that if you go to the 4 Islamic jurisprudence, if you went to the mainstream interpretations, Ibn Kathir, I can tell, you can find 100 of them in the streets, all of them interpret it in a literal way that
Okay, so in your-
so that is the new one. That is great.
So in your new reform commentary of the
I have a
Quran,
new one too.
so how have you addressed it? In
I
your
addressed
comment?
it in a different way.
Oh.
Like for number one, for example, I said the Quran put only 2 options. There is a verse in the Quran that says فَإِمْسَاكٌ بِمَعْرُوفٍ أَوْ تَسْرِيحٌ بِإِحْسَانٍ, which means dealing with women. Women have to be either to be good with them, or to be generous and even more than good. That is the meaning.
But,
So
but
I-
wait a minute. The issue she's asking
This
is,
particular
the issue she's asking is, do you approach the word in a literal term? What do you do with authenticity of Scripture? Because
I
if you
took the
take and
verse
cross it off,
outside of
you
wives.
can't cross it off. So there's
No.
another passage that says, cut the hands of those who steal. Those of us who believe you can apply some things and not others say that's metaphorical. To sever them from
but
society, not sever
this
them
is
from their
our
limbs.
or a new interpretation. The mainstream one that's affecting the Muslim world today, and you can prove or disprove me. That's so easy. You go to Islamic institutes.
No one is arguing about that.
This is why dinner was so
Can I-
much
can
fun
I-
last night.
Can I have the floor here?
Of course.
Okay.
Of course.
These debates will carry on. This is the human condition. Can I take you back to Jalaluddin Rumi on this issue?
Of course.
About the Quran, if you bear with me? This is the poet that I mentioned, Rumi, right? Many of you have heard about him. But he was a great teacher. He was a great jurist. He was a great, in many different things. But he's from the 12th century. You can imagine he's sitting in a classroom in the 21st century, just as we're debating. This is what he says about the very issue about words being debated, Quran and its meaning and so on. So I'll quote him. And to my women friend, please excuse me of what I'll read to you. It's not me, it's Jalaluddin Rumi. So if you get offended with Rumi, not with me. So here it is. This is from Rumi's famous book on the Quran. And one paragraph I'm reading. The Quran is a two-sided brocade. Some enjoy the one side, some the other. Both are true and correct, as God Most High wishes that both groups might have use from it. In the same way, a woman has a husband and a baby. Each of them enjoys her in a different way. The child's pleasure comes from her bosom and her milk. That of the husband from kisses and sleeping and embrace. Some people are children on the path and drink milk. These enjoy the external meaning of the Quran. But those who are true men know of another enjoyment and have a different understanding of the inner meanings of the Quran. In effect, what Rumi was saying, Muslims argue as children. They imagine that they understand the infinite. The infinite, that is God, is under immense pressure to communicate with finite little creature like us. So the language breaks down, meaning breaks down. This is the problem with the Hebrew Bible. This is the problem with the Quran. This is the problem with any sacred scripture. The finite mind, and ours is a finite mind, struggling to understand the infinite mind, and the radicals. I mean, we have been hearing a lot about radicals. Radicals are the people who presume they know the infinite mind. They are infinite, and they're going to tell each one of us how to live our lives.
Absolutely.
So the core issue, as I said, is culture. The entire debate that is happening is the debate of the pre-modern culture. You see, we are in the 21st century and there's Taliban running around, measuring beard, and I'm not joking, this is what happens, measuring beard, or whether your pant cuffs are proper length, okay? And then there are us and others who say, live and let live. Because the Quran says also, dinakum, what is it?
لكم دينكم ولي دين.
Exactly.
You
So I have
your
to
own
turn to
religion
my
and
brothers in Arabic. You have your way, to me my way. You live peacefully, I live peacefully.
Yeah,
We
and it's clear
negotiate.
no
and we do.
compulsion in religion.
But that's the modern culture.
Let
So it
Elham.
comes down to understanding the role of the individual and the role of the
I
collective.
think Elham has something that you'd like.
Yeah.
Yes, I find it fascinating the way you used it, and it's actually opening certain spiritual path. Nevertheless, I would basically say, I will not try to find a different meaning for the word daraba. I will just say there are limits on how far you could go with a religious argument. Because we have things, whether in the Quran, in the Bible, in the Torah, there are things that do not belong to today. And that, I mean, you have certain things in the Quran
Polygamy.
about women. نساءكم حرث لكم فأتوهن
You
أينما
can
شئتم.
separate history from religion, absolutely.
And with that, we basically say that was that time, that reflects that certain historical, social structures of that time. Today, we are living in a different one.
The battle against the Jewish tribe, do you apply that to 620 CE? Or do you apply that to profiling Jews into infinity?
And
It's
then
that,
you bring
it's that
the
simple
spirituality
historical.
and
You
the
separate
relationship.
God's message in general from that simple
Okay,
passage.
but this brings up a very key issue. If we, as educated modern Muslims, can say this, and I do, that there are certain concepts and notions that were for the 7th century, we don't want them today. How do we convince the radicals, the ISIS, because they live, but they take this, they justify the Quranic verses that allow them to beat women.
But they're not our
to have sex
constituency.
slaves.
They're not our. They are the symptom of a disease. Their constituency is our constituency, which is youth and young adults trying to learn their faith. And on the one hand, you've got the Hamza Yusufs of the world who come across as moderate, runs Zaytuna Institute, and yet he takes a hadith about the end of the world and says America's materialism is all about the end of the world and all that. So we have to use social media platforms to counter what we are for, rather than simply say they're wrong, this interpretation's wrong, and what we're against. It's just like working against drug use. You know, you don't go to Colombia and say, well, let's work with the government on distributing the drugs better because, you know, it's not working. No, we give youth something else so that the drugs would never be something they would even think about so that they feel better.
We have to be aware where we ourselves are located in time and space. That is a context and what we're dealing with. In a general sense, It is a question of the struggle of the Muslim world. Morocco is far different from Javanese island, right? But I'm talking now in general sense. The specificity will be different. It is the struggle for freedom and democracy. And I'll take the example of Pakistan. Pakistan history with election. I take the example of Pakistan because it is the second or the third largest Muslim country. America has been deeply involved with Pakistan for the last 70 years in just about every category of foreign policy, military policy, and economic policy. And Pakistan's election just happened. There was an election only about 2 weeks ago. So, and the record of Pakistan's election have been very mixed. But the serious point that I'm getting at is that if the election process continues, that if the people are allowed to participate in election process, with all of its problematic, but that process continues and election takes place, we can predict, just as you as a doctor can predict if you take unboiled water, what will happen. So we can predict that the very people that Raheel is talking about will be there, but they will be in the very margins of the society, the 2 to 3%. Because in every single election in Pakistan, whenever it has been held, the party of the Muslim Brothers, of the mullahs,
Jamaat
of the
Islam.
Jamaat,
Yeah.
they've never been able to get more than 10% of the vote.
But wait a minute. I
But
actually.
here is the point.
No,
the
but you're-
10% of the vote they
okay,
haven't been able to get, but the military institution, establishment, have cultivated that 10%, and the Americans have supported that 10%.
But wait a minute, Salim. The West needs to no longer simply gauge. Imran Khan, the cricket player who is now going to run
Yes.
Pakistan,
Yes.
3 decades ago was a
Yes.
playboy married to a Jewish wife.
Yes.
Then he divorced her, then married a more moderate Pakistani
But-
wife who didn't have a hijab. Then when he decided to run for office, he wore a niqab-wearing radical Salafi Islamist, part of Maududi's Jamaat Islamiyya
Yeah.
thought, in order to get elected. So the bottom line is our ideologies, the West has not been helping, hasn't even had as a strategy.
The point is, if, again, the specificity. If you want to get into the specificity of Pakistan history, the very creation of Pakistan was by a man who was
whole
a
thing is a
wine drinking.
faulty-
So no,
yeah.
no, no. So I mean, since you raised this issue that Imran Khan married a Jewish woman, he did this, all this, I'm saying these are ultimately, in historical sense, cosmetic. There is a movement. That movement, whether we sitting here, we are not only finite, we are limited. You know, our mortality is limited. We will be gone. So we're talking about historical space and historical viewpoint. There is an inexorable and invariable and inevitable process that cannot be defeated. That is modernity. And all of these things that is happening is trying to defeat
But modernity is
modernity.
losing.
And it cannot, so we have to
It's losing.
act to help make the process of change into modernity easier. But even if we drop dead this moment, that process is continuing.
Okay,
Yeah,
Elham.
but if I may just insert something, talking about Pakistan, I agree with you. It's very important to let the process work,
Elections are not-
go on. The problem is basically the structures that I talked about, because you talked about the establishment of Pakistan. Think about what happened since the late 70s, you know, and how, by the father, Benazir Bhutto, and how the Deobandi movement was mainstreamed, how it was allowed to build all of these thousands of madrasas, indoctrinating generations. This has led to a situation where right now minorities like the Ahmadiyya are under attack constantly. Now, Amran, in order for him to come to power, he put his hand in hand with the Deobandi and the
Exactly.
Barlevi.
Yep.
Yeah.
Both of them.
In order to
these
get
two
elected.
groups.
Correct. We are not born in a time and space of our own choosing. We are born in a time and spaces into which we arrive. So when you raise those issues, bringing in all the other factors in. So when you talked about the rise of Deobandi, you talked about the rise of the madrasa school system. Now let's contextualize it. We're talking about one country and one specific situation, but let's contextualize it.
I think
it was
there
the overthrow of Bhutto. It was the rise of a military dictator. It was the embrace by the United States of the military dictator.
I think there are
On
other
and on and on.
questions
So you
that we
see,
need to address.
we thank you for this discussion on Pakistan. And just related to this, and people have asked me to ask this, do women wear hijab because they want to?
yes and no.
Some percentage yes, some percentage no.
That's not enough. Answer better.
You want a
Okay,
better
so
answer.
let me take you again back to when I was growing up and my experience in Pakistan. In my family, we did not cover our heads. There were elderly aunts and grandmothers who would take a scarf like this and loosely cover their head with it. It was never imposed. And it was worn as a symbol of respect. For example, when my grandfather came into the room, my mother would cover her hair. And that was it, nowhere out on the street. In the late 1970s, when Khomeini went back to Iran and said, the revolution took place, and when the Saudi money started floating into Pakistan, this Saudi-style hijab, so the scarf that you see tightly tied under the skin, is either Irani, Khomeiniist, or Salafi Saudi. This came into Pakistan on the backs of petrodollars. Today, I would say that it is largely political, and it is a symbol of that Salafi ideology, because if you ask some of the young women why they are wearing it, and interestingly, the older generation, the mothers and grandmothers, are not covering their head. It is the young women. And if you ask them, they think that, that this makes them somehow more religious and more sacred. But I would say it's become very politicized. Elham, what is your take?
I would say Islamists, when they start with women.
Yeah.
And
They start with what?
With women.
Women.
With women.
I
It's
was
just
one of
basically
these.
a main issue.
Of course.
To cover them, to control them, and you would see, actually it started, it's like you have the Wahhabi and their ideas about the women, and they took the Najdi tradition, it's a tradition of
Tribal
niqab,
tradition, yeah.
niqab, and mainstream it as the Islamic, okay? So you have one tradition turned towards. That's starting from the 18th century, okay? But when it comes to the hijab, you have a tract written by Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, in the early 20th century. Read it, 10 pages. And these 10 pages are telling us how to deal with women and covering women and insisting on the hijab. Now, it's a political idea, a kind of a signature. But on the other hand, why women are wearing it, you realize that you have those who actually believe this is a religious duty, so they are doing it. Okay?
But this is what I wanted to ask you. Now, I'm not an Arabic speaker, but I tried to find in the Quran, does it say that you have to cover your head? The word hair has never been used.
No. In the
And it's not even
Quran,
hijab,
if you
it's,
look at it, it's actually a kind of a separation between slaves, Muslim women, and free Muslim women.
So
I mean,
the
come on, guys.
word
Like,
hair, cover your hair.
that's
was
why
never
Umar
Yeah,
ibn
hijab
Khattab
actually
al
means-
Khalifa, he had basically, he used to punish
You want to
slave
ask a
women
question? Okay.
who were trying to emulate Muslim women.
Okay, we have a complaint from the audience that we are talking too much. We want to ask questions.
No, I
So,
think we
yeah.
I've got the
listen
mic
to
over here.
people.
Okay.
Yeah,
First of all, I want to thank you all for all of your efforts, and probably most importantly, your courage in this struggle for the soul of Islam. May your efforts for reform
Amen.
come to pass. So my question,
Thank you so much.
may we be living in an era where it's more possible than it was? It was mentioned in the beginning of this 4-hour session that at the turn of the last century, that radical Islam wasn't as prolific as it is today. In fact, it was a very big minority, a small minority. is what's going on now in Saudi Arabia. And it was mentioned that Gulf money has propagated this Islamic radicalism. Is it possible that what's going on now in Saudi Arabia with the efforts of the Crown Prince to modernize, now women are driving in Saudi Arabia, there has been an opening to Israel, even a recognition of Israel's right to be a state, a Jewish state, and other things that are happening, in exchanges and investment in Israel. Is it possible that we are on the precipice of some of this kind of reform and the diminishing of the money going into the bad type of Islam that you guys have been talking about today?
Can I start? Yeah. You know, I've always said Islam doesn't need necessarily a Martin Luther, yet we need a John Locke and a Thomas Jefferson. And MBS is not a Thomas Jefferson. And the reason is everything he's done has been political, rules that he can quickly change. He's invited the WWE to have the Rumble in Riyadh, so they had fake wrestling to show their, you know, sort of change in culture, if you will. There has been no, and this is the key, no theological judges and jurists that have backed up any of what we're talking about. When he said women can drive, he just passed the edict. He didn't say because they're equal, because they should have property rights, because they should be able to vote. They put them on a few councils in Southeast Najd area and said now they're beginning and they have this 2030 plan. So they always come up with plans that'll happen in 15 and 30 years, and yet what they're doing now is done more for window dressing. If they really are pro-Israel, and again, that's more geopolitical expediency than it is actually changing the anti-Semitism. When we went and talked to them, when I was on the U.S. Commission, we asked them to change their school textbooks, and they would keep whiting out this and that, and I would tell my fellow commissioners, you can't take Mein Kampf and white out a few lines and change its Nazism, right? So they have a supremacist approach to Judaism and the Jewry, the world Jewry, that needs to change with deep reforms where they have jurists that are running their Sharia courts. They still have their public chop shop where they invite people to take videos while they cut the arms of people who steal. They've arrested more women in the last 6 months than they have in the last 10 years that have been taking selfies and videos while they drive. So it is all because of geopolitical, diplomatic balance and pressures against Qatar that they want, which makes sense because of Qatar's relationship with the Brotherhood. But don't be deceived that, and please give me an example, and I tell any of you, where in history there has been democratic liberalization from the top down. That government is going to need to be overthrown. There's going to need to be a revolution, and then this country will get a lot worse. It'll become maybe ISIS, right? At least it doesn't have a nuclear weapon. But all I can tell you is that 1 year of the Muslim Brotherhood running Egypt did more to destroy the ideas of political Islam than 60 years of Nasser, Sadat, and Mubarak. So they need to grow, and as that's somewhat of what Salim was saying. They need to go through a maturational process of working through democracy, having revolutions in order for that to happen. The king is not just going to start handing out things. It's all just window dressing.
We have a lady here as well.
Hi, I have a question, a more specific question on female mutilation. A number of years ago, I was sent by a foundation I was working for to the United Nations to be part of an NGO called Defense for Children International. Their three biggest problems were improper incarceration of children, children soldiers, and female mutilation. I was at a meeting in Skopje, and I made comments about female mutilation. The question is, I was attacked by someone from Africa who was a chief that said, just because you do not do certain things in the United States doesn't mean we don't do things that are part of our religion. And I want to ask Dr. Jasser, I was under the impression until just now, when it was said that about 50,000 young ladies in the United States were being subject to female mutilation. Now, is that true? And who's doing it if they're doing it? I doubt a physician would do something like that.
It's very true, and Raheel and others can speak to it too. I just did a panel with Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Alan Dershowitz about this issue, and Alan actually, we were debating him because Ayaan and myself and Raheel have a zero tolerance policy that there is Nobody should ever be touching the genitals of a young girl, ever. There's no reason to do that. And what happens is sometimes the Jewish community feels that that could, and Dershowitz is one of them, that could be a slippery slope to impact male circumcision. So they feel it's a religious freedom issue as long as it's just a nick or whatever. And my point to him, by the end of the debate, we're going to get the video posted. Alan turned to me and said, "You've changed my mind." And I said, "Well, I want to put this on my resume that I changed, Alan Dershowitz's mind, and so did Ayan." And at the end of the day, we said, listen, the intent, first of all, male circumcision has been done for 4,000 years, and it'd be hard to show demonstrative harm from it. Secondly, the intent is a desexualization. They feel that girls are born hypersexual, so they need to declitterize them in order for that to be done, in order for that male domination to happen. So whether it's a nick or a drop of oil, it is a cultural approach to the woman so that she knows forever she's inferior and has been protected from her innate evil self, which is hypersexual. And imams in Virginia and elsewhere have been shown on memory, global, even though it was local here in Virginia, giving intellectual theological defenses of that. There are now 2 doctors on trial in Michigan. Finally, the feds are beginning to convict physicians for this, and they were doing it underground, shipping girls in from Minneapolis in part of the Dawoodi Borough community, which actually, interestingly, is more moderate on some things, but they were doing this FGM underground in Detroit at a clinic, and now that trial has finally opened the eyes of some of the liberal media, and we're starting to educate folks about this is just the tip of the iceberg.
The American Academy of Pediatrics some time ago approved nicking of young female genitalia because people living here were taking their daughters overseas to get it done.
It's like they compared it to use of needles for drugs, that they could hand out needles.
And the American Academy said, well, if they go over there, it's worse, so let's do it okay over here, but just a little bit. It's amazing.
That's amazing.
Hi, thanks for your humanity. My question is how to connect the dots. Yesterday, and I wouldn't give up on the Aspen Institute, there's a woman, Peggy Clark, who has a program with Palestinian women and women all over the world. Madeleine Albright lives here and is very involved in all of that as well. Yesterday, they had a program called Diplomacy in a Fractured World. And if you can look up online, all the people were talking about the same thing we're talking about. One was a woman, Farah, I forgot her last
Farah
name.
Panda, yeah.
And she's with Council of Foreign Relations. Chris Hill is in charge of the Kobo Institute of... How are you connecting the dots is my question. And then do you know about Steve Hassan, who's a leading cult expert, who could help? Because the question is how to get the narrative out. If not on Facebook, how to get it out on Radio Free Europe, how to get the limited State Department to connect to you, how to get the Pentagon to give you money.
Oh, some of you have to answer that.
Don't all answer at once.
It's about, go ahead, Salim.
Well, in how to connect the dots, we are trying, all of us, and we all have our own perspectives and where we're coming from and so on and so forth. But I think the subtext or the main point of your question is, what is our responsibility as Western powers? And I think that's where the heart of the problem is in terms of global foreign policy, global responsibility in foreign policy. What is the West's role? Now, we can run, and Zuhdi has alluded to it a number of times, and we can run and spend the whole afternoon about the complicity of the West. And I say this not for polemical purposes, because we all have to take responsibility, and I fall back to what my prophet, Jesus, said, take the beam out of your eyes, and if you don't take the beam out of your eyes, you cannot deal with the problem. So the West has been complicit, as Bernard Lewis said in his book, The Crisis of Islam, with the KKK of the Muslim world. That is, since the foundation of Saudi Arabia, the West embraced the Saudi Arabia. It's like embracing KKK, and that is the Islam that has spread with the Western embrace of it. Not only in Saudi Arabia, but all across, in Pakistan. And I think the 21st century, if we're going to save ourselves from what happened, ironically, beginning with the 21st century, that is the 9/11 event, and the worst, because the jihadists will not bite an eyelid to blow up the world with nuclear weapon, and I don't say this facetiously. If the nuclear weapon falls in the hands of the jihadists in Pakistan, which is a nuclear weapon, most people in this room don't know why it is so important for Americans to have troops. Now we have 15,000 troops in Afghanistan. You know, the troops in Afghanistan is not to fight the Taliban, it's to monitor the movements of what's happening inside Pakistan and to interdict if there's any possibility of a leakage on the nuclear weapon system. So what is the West's responsibility? Very quickly, and I think this, you all can hold a conference on this, you know, and I'd love to come back to your paradise and expand upon it. But we don't have to invent anything. We have that already. The page is there. Do you remember, as Jews, the Helsinki Agreement? See, I don't see any hand going up in this room. Oh, you do remember. Some of you do remember. 1975, Senator Henry Jackson was instrumental in. You know what was the key issue of the, and this was at the height of the detente period, ABM negotiations. What was the key issue? It was just one basic series of article and sub-article that eventually, 20 years later, led to the complete explosion and evaporation of Soviet Union. You recall what it was? That we, the European countries, will not trade with the communist Warsaw Pact countries unless they respect human rights. That led to the expulsion of Solzhenitsyn, remember? That led to the coming of Natan Sharansky, remember? That was one issue. I mean, that led to the Jews from Russia going to Israel. That was just the one issue. We will not trade. There will be no most favored nation status given to Russia, Soviet Union, or any of the Eastern unless they respect human rights, that which they have signed on to as part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. We need the G7 countries and the Western governments to put back the Helsinki Agreement in whatever name you want. Put it back and say, we will not have any dealings with the OIC country. Not allow, I mean, taking Trump to the court over whether there will be 6 countries from where they can come. No movement. We will not allow this unless you begin respecting what you have signed on to. And this is not about going and telling Pakistan and Egypt how to run their affairs. Just telling that. You see how rapidly things will change.
But I also think that
See,
part of
that
the
will
solution,
empower those Muslims like us in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, in all these countries, empower us as it empowered Natan Sharansky. You see? And every other talk is simply, you know, we are dealing with the local domestic issue, where they're trying to please the Obama and the Democrats with Linda Sarsour running around. Here is Zuhdi sitting here, and here there's Linda Sarsour.
right?
And
So
on and so
that's
forth.
the point, is that it needs a whole of society approach, which is instead of just approaching Islam after an attack, after a base is found in New Mexico now with kids that were there. By the way, the imam's one of the fathers of the kids in this New Mexico club that was a horrific child abuse terrorist training area turns out to be an imam I talked about in my book that believes that's Linda Sarsour's friends, etc. So why aren't the Jake Tappers of the world? Jake retweets my stuff all the time, and yet I've never been on his program. Americans should realize we should become commonplace names in the conversation of Islam so that we can debate Linda Sarsour, and they should have both of us on their program. So one is to make the platforms have our names become commonplace so that that happens. Second, President Trump talked about a commission on radical Islam in the campaign, and yet that seems to not be going anywhere. We should convene a commission chaired by a Muslim that looks at radical Islam and begins a whole of government approach so that we look at the ideas in the nonviolent area of work rather than simply the violent area. And third is to begin to bring the topics, make a list of subjects that your congregation here and elsewhere addresses, which is unrelated to terrorism, but related to anti-Semitism, women's rights, secular governance. Start to have platforms where you bring in reformers and have us debate others on those platforms so that you're not getting a homogenized, monolithic approach to Islam. Yep.
The women's movement sort of said, we don't want to impose on Muslim women because we fear backlash. So that takes it to a higher level.
There needs to be a daily jihad report, just like you have a weather report.
And,
It can't.
and furthermore, just to add to
Serious,
what you
it's-
said about connecting the dots, we depend on all of you to help connect the dots. That's why we are here. You know us, you know what we have said, it's been documented. Spread the word and, just keep us connected. What I'd like to see, ideally, as a vision, is this panel travel across the United States in every single state.
Find people who will. I'll buy you Minnesota, or Minneapolis.
Okay, hands up for states.
Atlanta, whatever.
Yes.
My last podcast was mini Saudi Arabia about Minnesota. Minnesota Arabia. What you like?
I want to thank you for your gift. I have wrestled with something for a long time, since 9/11, because I have deep friends in Egypt, spent a lot of time in the Mideast, and after 9/11, I sat down and read the Quran, studied the life of the Prophet. I've read your book. I've read a number of books, and I have a few answers here, but I want to dive into something that's probably quite dangerous. With your permission, I humbly ask. The Prophet is considered the perfect man in the Islamic world. And I know a bit about his life. I'm not an expert. And I think of Badr and Raza, if I'm pronouncing those words right. They're horrific. 700 Jewish men lined up, their heads chopped off, on and on. The whole Saudi peninsula at one time was Christian villages, Jewish villages, pagan villages, etc., basically just wiped out. Christianity has done hideous things, but they never were based on the teachings of Jesus. I don't know what to do with the Prophet, and I would like you to address this because this is a very thorny issue, and I avoid it. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. Thank you for the honesty. I think one of the answers to this is an op-ed that I wrote recently in Arabic, okay? And it was read by nearly 250 million people in the first week, okay? I don't know now the number because they disappeared, but it was just huge. The title of it was this issue. And it was putting the Muslim world, this was in Arabic, so I should probably have an English translation for it. Muslims have to choose between either Muhammad of the Sunnah, which is the extra Quranic things like the Hadith is not the Quran, okay? Or Muhammad of the Quran. So I put a clear comparison between Muhammad as described in the so-called Sunnah books, like Al-Bukhari and others and many other books, or Muhammad as described in the Quran. For example, Muhammad in the Sunnah married a young girl of 7 years old. You see, yes, and he commenced marriage when she was 9. This is the Sunnah. This has never been mentioned in the Quran. In fact, the Quran clearly in other verse said the meaning that, I'll give you the English just fast, not to marry until the girls reach maturity, which could be mental maturity plus body maturity as well, okay? So you see Muhammad in the Sunnah is different. Muhammad is in the Sunnah, which is the extra Quranic sources for Islam, is a man who knows that he's 100% in paradise, 100%. But Muhammad in the Quran, the verse is clearly saying to him, وَلَا أَدْرِي وَمَا أَدْرِي مَا يُفْعَلُ بِي وَلَا بِكُمْ, which means I don't know what's going to happen to me or to you in the day of judgment. Okay, so in summary, I will not go to the 10 points or 12 points I mentioned, but in summary, the answer to this is the features of Muhammad as written in the mainstream books that include Sunni and the Hadith are really not good, if not evil. You see, but the features in the Quran contradicts them in many situations. So this is how I see it. So if Muslims wants really to follow the footsteps that's in the Quran, that generally speaking can be okay in most circumstances. But if Muslims want to follow the description of Muhammad in the Sunni books, as you mentioned, killing 800 Jews in one night, taking their wives as sex slaves, if they follow this, this is absolute evil. So I just want to create this distinction, and hopefully by pushing one more than the other, we can win the whole.
Can I add?
Sure.
Yeah. There's a couple things here that's really important. Is that when I taught my Islam, my grandparents and my parents pointed out the Quran actually God corrects Muhammad many times. He's not a perfect man. He wouldn't be corrected if he was conceived to be perfect. Yeah. And he also wore three hats. He was a messenger of God. So there are passages in the Quran in which directly it's clear that Muhammad is simply passing through a message. And there's others passages in which it's simply relating history that happened at the time. So the prophet's the head of state, the head of a military, and the messenger of God. We can't reform Islam unless we remove those two roles from the religion, which is head of state and head of military. Those have to be removed. Now, the demonization of the Prophet Muhammad, I know you feel that that's real. I can't even convince you all that there's been 80 chemical weapons attacks in Syria in the last 2 years, let alone convincing you that the Prophet was moral or immoral in the 7th century, right? Even with all the information we have and pictures I can show you of chemical weapons responses in Syria that my family told me, I have a hard time convincing 1 out of 10 Americans that Assad is an evil genocidal criminal. So on the other side of the equation, you can't, yes, we believe the Prophet Muhammad was chosen because of his character. I don't think strategically, take what I believe in the moral character of the Prophet, take it as mythology, just as if you're a Jew, you believe the deification of Jesus is mythology. But you're right. Jesus' ministry was 3 years. He was never head of state. He was never the head of a military. It was simply a short ministry. In Islam, it was more close to Moses in that he ran a state that did a lot of stuff. So the passages in the Quran, we can argue about whether it was a legitimate act after a war of what happened between Banu Qurayza. It was horrific. I was in the U.S. Navy. We did a lot of things that I felt were moral, but yet were acts of war. When our generals in the Middle East are fighting the Taliban, if our American general came and said, kill those who are attacking you and are destroying America, I think the death of thousands of Taliban was a moral act. Now, does that mean Banu Qurayza was like that? I don't know. It was a war at the time.
It's not even the Quran.
It's not even
the Quran.
Well, they're
This
messing.
story
The
is
battle
not
is
even-
mentioned. The battle is mentioned. So at the end of the day, I think what matters to you all is, are there going to be Muslim normative? Our interpretations are not normative. You're exactly right. But can we get normative interpretations, mainstream interpretations
that's the point.
that separate that out and say, you know what, the time for a Muslim military is done. No more militaries in the name of Islam, it's in the name of secular states.
Yeah.
I think Salim has something.
That is what I want.
And last, what would Muhammad do if he were alive today? That's the question I ask my kids. What would Muhammad do? If he were alive today, would he believe in America, or would he want to establish an Islamic state? That should be an important question.
Well, I would invite you, I'm not trying to sell my book here, but I would invite you to read my book, because I have dealt with this issue head on. And here are the facts. We don't have the time, unless Sir Raheel makes a little bit time for me, but here are the facts. The events that you talk about did not happen in the way it has been reported in the history books. Number one. Number two, all the description of Banu Qurayza and what the Prophet did and didn't do comes from Muslim sources, nothing from outside Muslim sources, that is the Arab sources. Yeah. And the first writing about this was done 150 years later by the very first biographer of the Prophet, Ibn Ishaq, which is open to question whether these are all fabricated stories. You might ask yourself the question, everyone might ask the question, why would such a story be fabricated? Well, they were fabricated to serve the tyrannical rulers and empower them to do what they can do by saying that this example was set by Muhammad. In the name of Muhammad, anything can be done, you know.
Exactly.
So that's. Now, let me quickly backtrack to my first point. It didn't happen because there is no reference to this in the Quran except a minor one verse in the Surah Al-Ahzab of what happened.
Which verse? What does
In
it mean?
Confederacy. You know, there's about how you treated the Jews of Medina. That's only two verses
the Manea.
in Surah just a moment. Then, I will now flush it out for you further. Within 30 years of the event, 30 years of the events that is happening, Muhammad died in 632. This event is supposed to have happened around about 627, 628. The first reference by a non-Muslim source appears in history. That is by an Armenian bishop by the name of Sibios in his book called The History of Heraclius, who was the Byzantine emperor at that time. He's contemporary of Muhammad. Sibios mentioned in his book that there were Arabs who came out and fought in defense of Edessa alongside Jews against the Byzantines. Okay? Arabs, he reported as sons of Ishmael fighting with the sons of Isaac against the Byzantine in defense of Edessa within 30 years. I have gone through the entire literature of this period. There is no Josephus among the Jews writing about this event. Why I mentioned Josephus? Josephus was there who wrote the history of the destruction of the temple, right? So now, the Jews are the most literate people, I'm talking contemporaneously, in that time. Jews have records of this. An event of the nature that Ibn Ishaq describes would have been echoing right across the Mediterranean world and the Roman world. The word would have gone, Jewish scribes would have written history about this, okay? Till today, there's not a single Jewish mention or record of the events that you cited. It all comes out of Ibn Ishaq's first report, okay? And then it has been embellished by others writers in support of their own tyrannical rulers, okay? So the question comes out to, why the story, if the story is true in the way Ibn Ishaq reported it, why is it in that time period non-Muslim writers reported? That's the number one question. As historians, that's what we look at. Number two, 627 is the event. Muhammad dies in 632. 636, 637 is the conquest of Jerusalem by the army, the Arab armies of Omar. And you know who celebrates the conquest of Jerusalem? The Jews. Because for the first time, the Jews who had been removed from Palestine, Judea and Samaria was named Palestine, Philistine. Jerusalem was named A Capitolona to eradicate and erase Jewish history. For the first time after nearly half a millennium, the Jews are free to enter Jerusalem. And not only free to enter Jerusalem, to establish the presence around the remains of the temple of Herod. Now, why would the Jews, ask yourself this question. We're not talking here sitting 1,400 years later and debating polemically about this event. Do the historical imagination. As Einstein says, do the scientific imagination. Think about it. Do a thought experiment. The Jews who entered Jerusalem in 637, who danced for their freedom, who embraced Umar, and Sibios, I just reported it, who made alliances to fight the Byzantines, why would they be dancing when, if they had known that Muhammad had massacred their brothers and sisters, their brethren, only a few years ago in Medina as reported? So my entire point, to sum it up, I know, we're all trying to hurry up, but this is such an important issue. This is the issue. The Muslim world is trapped in its lies, and they're not going to say that this is not true because it serves their purpose. Especially in the Arab world, it serves their purpose. Especially in the period after 1918 with Jerusalem issue, Balfour Declaration and the Mufti of Jerusalem, it served their purpose to demonize the Jews and to say this is how we treated the Jews, no less than the Prophet. So that serves their purpose, and the rest of the Muslim world has gone along with it, with the money of the KKK, that's the Saudi Arabia, and from the purpose of the Jews. It served the purpose too, ironically. We are the victims of who? Of Muhammad. Muhammad killed so many people, forgetting that if Muhammad killed, Muhammad was taking his precedent from Moses. Because in the very commentary on this, two references to surah, you can go and read this. Read it in my book. The reference is given to Exodus in the commentary. And in the Exodus, the reference is, you remember to what?
Can we carry on
The
this
calf-
conversation later? We need other questions.
The calf
Thank
and the
you.
killing of 3,000. So I think we have to be,
Yeah.
and this
And
demands greater
why-
attention.
I'm going
Yes,
to present
sorry.
you a copy of his book.
Sorry if I took time, but
Maybe that will. So, yes.
Well, thank you all for giving us hope. And it seems rather unfair. You have your hands full, and I'm going to ask you to help us. And this is my question. It has become fashionable to call any criticism of Islam Islamophobia on the Western left.
Yeah.
There used to be other fashions before, like feminism and things like that. And it seems to me that the left has to make a choice in this case, because much of the criticism of Islam today is directed towards helping minorities. And the left itself thinks it's more important to call these criticisms Islamophobia. So how do you suggest we deal with it? As I said, I'm sorry, it's unfair that you are put in the spot for this, but we don't know how to deal with them.
I think it's easy. Just stop using the term Islamophobia. I mean, the Jewish community talks about anti-Semitism, not Judeophobia, because human beings have rights. Ideas don't have rights. Islamophobia was a term created by the OIC because they think Islam, the idea, has rights. It has no rights. You can criticize Islam from here to eternity.
Exactly.
And the more we use that term, the more you empower the invocation of blasphemy laws in the West. I have a podcast, Reform This, and I do a word every week. Last week, I did the word Islamophobia and why we shouldn't use it. So look it up. It's a longer answer.
And the word Islamophobia was created exactly as you say to stop conversation and to stop people from asking questions. But I will add to say that there are respectful ways of having conversation and communication as we are having today. No question is off limits, and there is nothing that you cannot ask.
I would like to add just some points here. I wrote an op-ed years ago in the Wall Street Journal. The title was How to End the Islamophobia, okay? And my point was that the word phobia in psychiatry is irrational fear of something. It has to be irrational. But honestly, when people have some criticism for the traditional Islamic teaching or Sharia, I can't call this a phobia because it is relatively rational. They see huge number of terrorist acts. They see female genital mutilation. They see stoning of women to death. They see silence of the Muslim street. And as I put it, and we'll end here, if the world has seen millions of Muslims demonstrating against bin Laden and ISIS, as they have seen them demonstrating against banning the hijab in France, Islamophobia will be ended. If the world see the majority of Islamic scholars standing against stoning of women, standing against killing apostates, standing against insulting Jews, Islamophobia will be ended. So I believe the only people who can really end Islamophobia are the Muslims themselves. This is my opinion.
Two more questions.
I'd like to thank you all very much for being here. I'd like to thank you, Alan, for inviting my wife and I to participate in sponsoring. I was a little bit shy at first, but after what I've seen and learned today, I'm very appreciative. Thank you. Earlier, you were talking about if we put restraints on the countries economically, they would backpedal. My concern is we've tried it in Iran, didn't really work, and it seems like, to me, the most terrorists come from the poorest nations. And so if people have something to lose, maybe they wouldn't be a terrorist. If they've got nothing to lose because they don't have much to eat or whatever else, am I off base completely, or is there any truth to what my thoughts are?
Just examine the 9/11 terrorists. There were what, 19, how many were there? 19. Most of them were Saudis, and there were a few Egyptian, maybe 2 Lebanese. I don't know the mix, but all of them were none of them were poor. All of them, were educated, and all of them had per capita income. Maybe some of them had more than any one of us sitting on this table, and coming from a region. I'm not taking it in the sense, the region. So Saudi Arabia per capita income, So the idea that the poor are the terrorists is not sustainable if you look at it, who are the people who are promoting it, using it. The poor might become an instrument. The poor can be used and abused. They're constantly being, whether it's an Afghan peasant boy or Iranian ayatollahs sending little teenagers to the minefield. But terrorism, and I think all of us will agree, and the ideology is spread by people in power and position
I think
of influence.
Who is actually financing? If you look at the financing, we always talk about Saudi Arabia. How about Kuwait?
Yeah, let me.
The Salafi movement,
Yeah.
the global Salafi movement is being financed by charities, personalities in Kuwait. You have within the United Arab Emirates, which banned the Muslim Brotherhood, nevertheless, some of the states within the United Arab Emirates who are sponsoring these organizations. So these are the rich countries. The poor are being instrumentalized. But why don't you tackle these countries? These are, from my perspective, are the ones that we have to insist on stop this bloody financing. And they're financing here also.
And then two really important points to your economic question. One is Iran is on the verge of collapse right now as we put the sanctions back in. And if you really, the thing that can most help the people of a country is to stop feeding their oppressors. So the opening of economies, I've never believed that, whether you're from Cuba to China or to Iran, that somehow having open economic relations with a regime that's torturing their people helps. And actually, when you sanction them, when we gave Iran billions, it actually went to genocide in Syria. It never went to the people. The people are carrying signs in Iran now as the rial has lost 80% of its value, and they're on the verge of collapse. The second thing I think is, if you look at Shia and Sunni in Islam, 10, 12% are Shia, 88% are Sunni. Attacks in America against Americans are 99% Sunni. Why is that? It's because we've had sanctions against Iran. There's been no flow of money from Iran. And even when there was, we had a $500 million foundation in New York, the Alevi Foundation. A skyscraper was taken over by the Department of Treasury in 2010 that included 5 mosques. So Hezbollah has not been able to radicalize as many. So there should be 1 out of 10 attacks, Shia radicals in America, and that's not been the case because of the Iranian sanctions.
You have a question? Yeah. There is a question here. Yeah.
Right here.
Okay. I just want to thank Alan and the JCC and all of you for coming. I thought this was a fabulous program. what makes me sad in a way is that we have seen nothing like this in Philadelphia. I go to anything that's informative like this. I've lived in Philadelphia area all my life. And I agree with you that you should put this roadshow should be sponsored, and all of you should get out there and do something together so that the word gets out. My first reaction to seeing Obsession and the Third Jihad, Rabbi Raphael Schor's programs for Jerusalem Online University, is how come we're showing this just in synagogues? This is going on and affecting people, minorities, and people all over the world. And my question was in the beginning and is still now, up until hearing you, where are all the moderates? Where are all the others, the non-radicals, that they cannot unite and put the extremists down? Expose them. I think someone used the word expose, and then educate, and then eradicate. So I thank you, but you've got to coalesce and all be working together and get out there and put on a roadshow all over the world so that people know the truth.
Thank you for the question. Yes, we will come to Philadelphia as soon as you can invite us.
There is.
Rabbi Green, that's Richard Green.
As well to that, and I'm sorry I have to make this point because none of the moderate Muslims can make this point, right? Look in front of you. If this is there are so many more moderate Muslims who would stand up, but if you're looking at these people and saying, why can't there be more people like you? Why can't there be more people standing up? Dr. Jasser is pretty exceptional. Tawfik's pretty exceptional. Raheel's pretty exceptional. The entire dais here is extremely exceptional. If they have to be that exceptional to even try to get on television, think how many there are that want to get on television that can't. People who want exposure but don't have exposure.
That's a really good point.
One of the main things that we do at Clarion, right, is to try to help give moderate Muslims or reformist Muslims a place to stand from, a place to effectively create enough of a groundswell that people want to hear what they have to say. So there are probably 5 others that we've identified that could be the next Zuhdi Jasser and Raheel Raza and the whole group.
Millions.
And we just have to do it. But the fact is that these are exceptional people, and you can't expect the average Muslim in America to be as exceptional as these people.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks, Richard.
There is a question here.
Thank you again for being here. They say Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. And I wonder, is it naive to think that they could partner with you to take this Muslim reform movement, because they are truly, sacrificing their children against Islamic Jihad and terrorists, and why wouldn't that be a natural fit to really make a significant difference?
Up until 6 months ago, I would have told you, as I've told Rabbi Green and others, that that's not a smart thing for Israel or for us to be labeled as sort of the Zionist conspiracy checkbox. What changed 6 months ago was I talked to Kamal Labwani, I've talked to secular liberal reformers in Syria. The white helmets were evacuated a few weeks ago thanks to Israeli forces. The IDF went in and saved them from a complete massacre of an organization that, for the most part, there might have been a few radicals that are part of the white helmets, but most of them were simply humanitarian guys that are going in to evacuate folks that had just been bombed. And yet, it needed Israel to go in there. So talking to these secularists in Syria, they tell me, we don't care about conspiracy theories. Israel is somebody we need to work with as we work with democracies. The conspiracy theories are dying on the internet, and we need to create relationships where we can, and you're exactly right.
Thank you for the question. Thank you so much for this. I do believe that Israel has the heart and the desire deeply to make the world better. And at a personal level, I visited Israel 3 times, and I can say God bless Israel, honestly. Thank you. My point here is that maybe doing it at a more like international style things or more human level, like having a group of people who care for humanity, like could be Muslims, Christians, Jews, Israelis, Egyptians, whatever, Americans, Canadians, just people who share a common principle of humanity. I do remember in this moment one day some show host on the radio asked me all of a sudden, what is your religion? And my answer was, I am a Muslim by birth, a Christian by the Spirit, a Jew by heart, and above all, I am a human being. So thank you. So if we took the thing, just a second, at the human level, I feel in this moment there will be no borders, no barriers. All are humans working together for the better of humanity. This is how I see it. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Now, I visited Israel for the first time in my life this summer, okay? And it was a decision that I took fully aware that it will reflect on my credibility within the Arab world. Okay? I have a name, well known. Okay. While I was doing this, I'm doing it nevertheless with the realization that Israel, yes, is the only democracy in our region, Tunisia to a certain extent, but nevertheless it has flaws.
It has what?
Flaws. It has flaws.
Oh, flaws. I thought you meant laws. Oh.
I will never ignore that. The latest law that right now excluded a certain portion of Israeli citizens is a problematic one. But I said, also in a series that I started to write in Arabic, there are many similarities. There are many similarities. Like it or not, there are. Okay? And I'm hoping that all the voices that would like to see peace in a manner that brings prosperity to this region, but in a manner that is fair as well, to the Palestinians as well. Why don't we come together? You know? Why don't we come together? And that would mean that we also have to face up to the problems. Because it's like, I'm not going to be a friend without being a mirror.
But as
a real mirror.
Yeah.
You know, from that perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. As a matter of honesty, if there are some flaws, as you said, I believe many, if not most of them, are reactive as a reaction to something. Like for example, when US here started to limit some freedoms after September 11th. So I believe if there was no terrorism, if there was love expressed from the Muslim world to the Jewish people, I do believe most of these flaws, if not all of them, wouldn't even exist. I'll tell you a very fast story. In Israel, I suffered from discrimination once. Do you know where? In Al-Aqsa Mosque. Yes, when I was entering it, I swear the name of God, this is what happened. There were some friends of us who were Christians and Jewish, and we want to go. It was organized by the American Jewish Committee. You can ask them about this story. Okay? And they said to us, only Muslims are permitted. No one told this to me when I visited the Church of Jesus or the Wailing Wall. I was allowed as a human being. There, they told us, you only Muslim and you have to rehearse part of the Fatiha to be allowed from the Quran. They want to make sure that you memorize the Quran well. And me and some Turkish friend back then, he was a professor in political science with us, he was a Muslim, we both refused to enter. The head
Why,
of
did they think you were from Oklahoma or what?
No. The point, no. They refused other friends to enter. I was able to enter.
I thought they had I thought they were quizzing you.
Too. But they refused the Christians and Jews to enter in it. Yeah. This was the only area where I found discrimination. It was the area controlled by the Muslims. Yes. Let's be very honest about this. So I, as a matter of solidarity with them, I said, no way, I will join you, I will not enter. the head of the American Jewish Committee came and really asked us in a way, please do it for me. This will be a big issue. There was the Jerusalem post that it will go here and there, and I don't want the program. She asked us, so for her, I did something against what, and I regret really doing it, to enter. But the concept here is, when you talk about Israel, one day I was listening to the adhan, the call for the prayer in Israel, while in the area where there are Arab. I took the cell phone and put it on the speaker, and I called my wife, Maha, to tell her, Maha, I am now in Israel. Can you imagine this? All what I have learned in our culture about the Israelis is wrong. So I think if there is any blame on some Israeli reactions, I think it's fair also to have the mirror and look to ourselves first.
Exactly.
Also, I believe.
On this happy note, I'm afraid we have to end.
Yeah.
And I'd like to thank all of you, and especially Alan, and thank you for your patience in sitting around for so long. And we hope that we will see you again in Philadelphia or forever. I'd like to thank my friends, Salim, Elham, Tawfik, Zuhdi. Thank you for...
Thank you, Raheel, for organizing it.
Thank you very much for bringing us here. We appreciate it.
Thank you for being here.
For
Thank you
Raheel.
so much.
Oh, sure.